Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you a descent into fear with 8 of the most disturbing true trucker horror stories ever documented. These accounts are not drawn from highway folklore or roadside legends, but from the lived ordeals of professional drivers whose nights on America's interstates became unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. Each story takes us deep into isolated highways and shadowed truck stops, revealing chilling encounters that span from unexplained radio transmissions to terrifying confrontations with forces both human and otherworldly. The testimonies have been meticulously preserved from first-hand accounts shared within the trucking community, ensuring that the authenticity of these experiences remains uncompromised, while driver names and specific routes have been altered to protect the privacy and safety of those involved. If you have not yet joined our growing community of horror enthusiasts, subscribe to Buried Files and activate the notification bell so you never miss a single night when the unknown comes calling from the darkness between cities. Be sure to leave a comment below and tell us about your own highway experiences or which story disturbed you the most. I need to tell someone about what happened to me and my partner on a lonely stretch of highway in rural Texas 6 months ago. The authorities classified it as an attempted robbery, but that does not even come close to describing the organized nightmare we stumbled into that night. My name is Christopher, and I have been driving team with my partner Jake for 3 years. We thought we knew how to handle ourselves on the road, thought we understood the dangers that came with hauling valuable cargo through remote areas. We were wrong. It was a Tuesday night in late March, and we were hauling a load of electronics from Houston to Dallas. Nothing unusual about the run, just expensive enough that the company insisted on a team operation for security. Jake was sleeping in the bunk while I took the night shift, driving through the kind of empty Texas countryside where you can go 20 miles without seeing another vehicle. Around 2:45 a.m. I spotted what looked like a car accident about half a mile ahead. Emergency flashers were blinking on the shoulder, and I could see figures waving flashlights trying to flag down traffic. My first instinct was to help. In 15 years of trucking, I had stopped at dozens of accident scenes, pulled people out of burning cars, called for ambulances, done whatever I could to help fellow travelers in distress. But something about this scene felt wrong from the beginning. For one thing, there were too many people. A typical accident might have 2 or 3 individuals involved, maybe a passerby who had stopped to help. But I counted at least 6 figures moving around the disabled vehicle, which appeared to be a sedan tilted at an odd angle on the shoulder. The pattern of their movements was too coordinated, too purposeful for people who were supposedly dealing with an emergency. I slowed down and pulled into the right lane, intending to stop and offer assistance despite my growing unease. That is when I noticed the second red flag. The disabled car's hazard lights were flashing, but I could not see any actual damage. No crumpled fenders, no broken glass glittering on the asphalt. No sign of the impact that should have put the vehicle there. As I brought my rig to a stop about 50 yards from the scene, one of the figures jogged toward my cab. He was a tall man in his 30s, wearing jeans and a work shirt, carrying a flashlight and moving with the kind of confident stride that comes from being in complete control of a situation. "Thank God you stopped," he called as I rolled down my window. "We have got a real bad situation here. Driver is trapped, and we need to get this car moved before another vehicle comes around that curve and plows into us." I woke Jake up and filled him in quickly while the man waited by my door. Jake climbed into the driver's seat to get a better look at the scene, and I could see him frowning as he studied the layout. "Something is not right about this," Jake whispered to me. "Look at how those other people are positioned. They are not trying to help with the car. They are watching the road in both directions like they are standing guard." I looked more carefully and realized Jake was absolutely right. The other figures were spread out in a defensive perimeter, some facing north, others south, all of them alert and watching for approaching traffic. It was the kind of formation you might see from a military unit or a well-trained criminal organization. "What kind of help do you need exactly?" I called down to the man by my window. "We need your truck to pull the car back onto the road," he replied smoothly. "Got a tow strap right here. Just take a minute and you will be on your way." That is when I noticed the third red flag. Despite supposedly dealing with a serious accident for God knows how long, none of these people looked stressed or hurried. Their clothes were clean, their movements calm and methodical. The man talking to me was not sweating, was not showing any signs of the adrenaline that comes with a genuine emergency. Jake made the decision for both of us. "We are going to call this in to the state police," he announced loudly enough for the man outside to hear. "They will have a tow truck out here within the hour." The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The man's friendly demeanor dropped away like a mask being removed. "I do not think you understand the situation," he said, his voice now cold and threatening. "We need your cooperation right now." That is when I saw the gun. He had been holding it low against his leg, hidden from view, but now he raised it until the barrel was pointing directly at my chest. At the same moment, the other figures around the disabled car stopped pretending to work on it and turned their attention fully toward our truck. "Driver, you need to shut off that engine and step out of the cab," the gunman ordered. "Both of you, hands where we can see them, no sudden movements." My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst, but years of training kicked in. Every trucking company drills their drivers on what to do in a hijacking situation. Comply with demands. Do not resist. Do not try to be a hero. The cargo is insured. The company would rather lose the load than lose their drivers. But Jake had different ideas. "Hold on tight," he whispered to me, then slammed the truck into gear and floored the accelerator. The gunman tried to jump clear as 40 tons of truck and trailer lurched forward, but Jake deliberately swerved toward him. I heard the man scream as he dove for the ditch, and then we were past the fake accident scene and accelerating down the highway. That should have been the end of it, but these people were not giving up easily. As we gained speed, I could see headlights in my mirrors. Multiple vehicles were pursuing us, and they were gaining fast. "These guys are serious," Jake said through gritted teeth, pushing our loaded rig as hard as it would go. "This is not some random robbery. This is organized." The first vehicle caught up with us about 3 miles down the road. It was a pickup truck with 2 men in the cab, and they pulled alongside us on the left. The passenger was leaning out the window with what looked like a rifle, trying to get a clear shot at our tires. Jake swerved hard to the left, using our weight advantage to force the pickup off the road. I watched in the mirror as it spun out and rolled into the ditch, but there were still at least 2 more vehicles behind us. "There!" Jake pointed ahead to a cluster of lights about 5 miles in the distance. "That has got to be a town. If we can make it there, we can get help." The next few minutes were the most terrifying of my life. The remaining pursuit vehicles took turns trying to disable our truck, shooting at our tires, attempting to ram us from behind. Jake drove like a man possessed, using every ounce of his skill to keep us on the road and moving toward those distant lights. We were less than a mile from what we hoped was safety when disaster struck. One of the pursuing cars managed to get alongside us on the right, and I could see the driver gesturing for Jake to pull over. When Jake ignored him, the car suddenly swerved into us, trying to force us off the road. Jake overcorrected, and I felt our trailer start to jackknife. For a moment that seemed to last forever. We were sliding sideways down the highway at 60 miles per hour, the screaming of locked-up brakes filling the air. Then physics took over and our truck rolled. I remember the sensation of being thrown around the cab like a rag doll, the deafening crash of metal and glass, the acrid smell of diesel fuel and burning rubber. When the world finally stopped spinning, I was hanging upside down in my seat, blood running down my face from a dozen cuts. "Jake?" I called out, but there was no answer. I managed to unbuckle my seatbelt and fell to what was now the ceiling of the cab. Jake was unconscious, hanging limp in his restraints, blood pooling beneath his head. I could hear voices outside, the sound of footsteps crunching on broken glass. "Get them out of there," someone was shouting. "We need to make this look like an accident." That is when I realized these people intended to kill us. This had never been about just stealing our cargo. They wanted to eliminate the witnesses. I managed to kick out the windshield and crawl through the opening just as the first man reached the wreckage. In the darkness and confusion, he did not see me slip away into the tall grass beside the highway. From my hiding spot, I watched in horror as they pulled Jake's unconscious form from the cab. "This one is still breathing," one of them said. "Not for long," another replied. I wanted to help my partner, wanted to rush back and fight for his life, but I was outnumbered and unarmed. The only thing I could do was try to get help, assuming I could make it to town without being caught. The next hour was a nightmare of crawling through ditches, hiding in culverts, and trying to stay ahead of the search parties I could hear spreading out behind me. These people were professionals, organized and methodical in their pursuit. They had radios, they had night vision equipment, and they knew the terrain far better than I did. By sheer luck, I managed to reach the outskirts of the small town just as dawn was breaking. I stumbled into the first business I found open, a diner that served the early morning crowd, and collapsed at the counter. "Please," I gasped to the startled waitress, "and call the police." My partner. They took my partner. The state police response was immediate and massive. Within an hour, there were dozens of officers at the crash site, but it was too late. The hijackers had vanished, taking Jake with them and leaving behind only our overturned truck and a crime scene that told no clear story. The investigation lasted for months, but they never found Jake. The FBI believed we had stumbled into the territory of a sophisticated cargo theft ring that had been operating throughout Texas and Louisiana. The fake accident scene was just one of several methods they used to stop and rob commercial vehicles. But we were the first drivers who had tried to fight back. I learned later that there had been at least 12 similar hijackings over the previous 2 years, but in every other case, the drivers had cooperated and been released unharmed after their cargo was stolen. We were the exception, the ones who fought back, and Jake paid the price for our resistance. I quit team driving after that. I could not stand the thought of putting another partner at risk, could not bear the responsibility of making life and death decisions for someone else. I still drive, but only solo runs, and I avoid remote areas whenever possible. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice that night. If Jake and I had just surrendered quietly, would he still be alive today? The FBI agent assigned to the case told me that fighting back was the correct decision, that these criminals had probably killed drivers before and would have killed us regardless. But knowing that does not make the guilt any easier to carry. The worst part is not knowing what happened to Jake, not knowing if he suffered, if he had any final words, if he understood that I tried to save him. The not knowing eats at you in ways that definite knowledge, however terrible, never could. If you are a driver reading this, learn from my mistake. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Do not stop for accidents that look too neat, too organized. And if you do find yourself in a situation like ours, remember that your life is worth more than any cargo, no matter how valuable. This happened to me about 3 months ago, and I still have trouble sleeping some nights because of it. I have been driving trucks for over 15 years, and I thought I had seen everything the highway could throw at me. But that cold March night on Interstate 80 in Nevada taught me that the road still has secrets I never want to discover again. I was making my usual run from Sacramento to Salt Lake City. It was just past 3:20 a.m., and I was running on black coffee and pure stubbornness. The highway was empty, nothing but endless desert and the occasional coyote caught in my headlights. My Peterbilt was humming along nicely, the radio was playing some late-night blues, and I was settling into that comfortable rhythm every trucker knows. 6 more hours to my destination, and then I could grab some real food and maybe 8 hours of sleep. That is when I saw him. At first, my tired brain processed it as a mirage. There was no way anyone would be out here on foot at this hour, especially not in the middle of nowhere with nothing but salt flats and Joshua trees for miles. But as I got closer, the figure solidified into the unmistakable shape of a man with his thumb out, asking for a ride. I slowed down, my air brakes hissing as I pulled over onto the shoulder. Through 15 years of trucking, I had picked up plenty of hitchhikers. Most were just down on their luck, trying to get to the next town or find work. But something about this man made every instinct I had start screaming warnings. He jogged up to my cab window as I rolled it down just an inch. The man looked to be in his mid-40s, thin build, wearing jeans and a red flannel shirt with black work boots. But his skin had this washed-out, almost translucent quality, like he had never seen sunlight or was caught perpetually under fluorescent lighting. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and when they settled on me, I felt a chill run down my spine. "Where you headed?" I called through the glass. "East." "Anywhere east," he replied, his voice oddly flat and emotionless. Every fiber of my being told me to drive away, but the thought of leaving someone stranded in this desolate stretch weighed on my conscience. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the passenger door. He climbed in slowly, sitting rigidly upright and clutching a battered backpack. The scent that came with him was strange. It was not the smell of sweat or the road, but something sharp and antiseptic, like ammonia mixed with fresh paint. The cab temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees the moment he settled into the seat. I shifted back into drive and merged onto the highway, trying to make conversation. "Name is David," I offered. He nodded but did not return the greeting. Instead, he stared straight ahead through the windshield, his fingers gripping that beat-up pack like his life depended on it. I tried again. "Where exactly are you coming from?" The man shrugged, the slightest hint of what might have been a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Nowhere, really. Just traveling." The next 20 minutes passed in complete silence except for the steady drone of my engine and the rhythmic slap of tires on concrete. I found myself alternating between watching the empty highway ahead and sneaking cautious glances at my passenger. I had picked up enough hitchhikers over the years to recognize the signs. Some were running from trouble, others were just down on their luck. But this man went beyond nervous or cautious. There was something fundamentally wrong about him. That is when I noticed it in my mirrors. Out of habit, I checked my side mirror for what must have been the 100th time that night. What I saw made my blood turn to ice. The man sitting right beside me cast no reflection. In the dim glass, I could see the empty passenger seat, the dashboard lights, even the texture of the upholstery. But where my passenger should have been, there was absolutely nothing. I blinked hard, convinced that exhaustion was playing tricks on me. Not enough sleep, too much caffeine, maybe the stress of the long haul was finally getting to me. But every time I glanced at that mirror, the same impossible sight greeted me. Empty seat, no shadow, no shape, no reflection at all. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. I focused on the road ahead, trying to control the panic that was building in my chest. Stories my grandfather used to tell came flooding back. Tales from rural Arkansas about haints and lost souls, about the dead who walked between midnight and dawn, forever seeking rides to places they could never reach. The silence in the cab became suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, could feel cold sweat trickling down my back despite the heater running full blast. The rational part of my mind kept insisting there had to be an explanation. But every primal instinct I possessed was screaming that I was sharing my cab with something that should not exist. "I need to drop you at the next rest stop," I said finally, my voice carefully controlled despite the fear clawing at my throat. The man slowly turned his head to look directly at me. His gaze felt like ice water running through my veins. "That will not be necessary. I know exactly where I'm going." "You sure about that?" I managed to ask. "Positive," he replied, and his voice seemed to come from somewhere far away. Minutes crawled by like hours. The heater, which had been working perfectly, suddenly began blowing cold air. Frost started creeping along the edges of my windshield, and my breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid cabin. I grabbed my phone, hoping to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. The world outside had turned hostile and alien. Even the stars seemed to disappear behind a veil of darkness. Without thinking, I started whispering a prayer I remembered from childhood, words my grandmother had taught me for protection against things that go bump in the night. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the atmosphere in the cab shifted. The passenger spoke quietly, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "Take the next exit. I have people waiting for me." Ahead, an old and battered road sign emerged from the darkness. "Lonewell's Rest Area, half mile." The green paint was faded and peeling, the reflective strips dulled with age. I pulled off the highway, my wheels crunching on the frost-covered gravel of what looked like an abandoned truck stop. The parking lot was completely empty, not a single other vehicle in sight. A retro neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie blue glow across a building that looked like it had been closed for years. All the windows were black as midnight. My passenger began to open the door, then paused and looked back at me. In that moment, his eyes changed. They became impossibly deep, glinting with a pale, otherworldly reflection that made my soul shudder. "Thank you for the ride, David," he said softly. "Keep your eyes on the road from now on. Some things are better left unseen." He stepped out and walked steadily toward the building. I watched in growing horror as the front doors, which should have been locked and chained, swung open soundlessly for him. He disappeared into the darkness beyond, and the doors closed behind him with no sound at all. I do not know how long I sat there, too terrified to move, my heart hammering against my ribs. Time seemed suspended in that moment, reality itself called into question. Then, like salvation breaking through a nightmare, headlights cut through the darkness. Another semi rolled into the lot and parked nearby. I practically fell out of my cab, desperate for contact with another living human being. The other driver stepped down, stretching after his long haul, then glanced toward the dark building. "Did you see a man go in there just now?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Red flannel shirt, black boots, carrying a backpack." The driver shook his head, frowning with concern. "Buddy, I have not seen a soul here tonight. This place has been boarded up for years, completely abandoned on my last 3 runs through here." I turned back toward the building, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The front doors were chained shut from the outside, heavy chains and padlocks that looked like they had been there for decades. The neon sign had gone completely dark. There were no footprints in the frost-covered gravel, no sign that anyone had walked this way. Fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run, I crept closer and peered through a crack in the filthy glass. Inside, I could see only abandoned bathroom stalls, overturned chairs covered in dust, and the kind of silence that comes with years of emptiness. As dawn finally broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I climbed back into my cab. I sat there for a long time trying to process what had happened, trying to convince myself it had all been some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion and too much caffeine. But deep down, I knew better. I did not tell anyone about that night, not at first. But rumors have a way of spreading among truckers, stories shared over coffee and pie at all-night diners. Within weeks, other drivers were talking about sightings of a specter in red on that lonely stretch of I-80, always looking for a ride east, always disappearing without a trace. When I finally broke my silence at a truck stop outside Reno, an old woman driver named Mabel listened to my story without interruption. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "I have seen him too," she whispered, leaning closer across the worn Formica table. "They say he is always looking for a ride east, trying to get somewhere he can never reach. Did he thank you when he left?" I thought about those final words, the way his eyes had changed, the gratitude in his voice that had seemed so genuine despite everything else. "Yes," I said. "He thanked me." "Then you are one of the lucky ones," she said, her weathered face serious. "Sometimes he does not." For months after that night, I avoided the Nevada stretch entirely, taking longer routes that added hours to my runs but kept me far from that cursed rest stop. I stopped picking up hitchhikers altogether and started carrying a small cross on my dashboard. But sometimes, on clear, cold nights when the moon hangs low and the highway stretches endlessly ahead, I swear I can still see a pale figure standing in the edge of my peripheral vision. He is always there and not there, waiting patiently for the next trucker willing to offer a ride to nowhere, forever seeking passage to a destination that exists somewhere between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. I still drive that road occasionally now, when the money is too good to pass up. But I never stop at rest areas after midnight, and I never look too closely in my mirrors on those long, dark stretches of highway. Some things, as my passenger warned me, are better left unseen. And if you ever find yourself driving through Nevada in the small hours of the morning and you see a lone figure with his thumb out on the side of the road, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. Trust me on this one. Some rides are not worth the risk. They're not. I have been an owner-operator for 8 years now, running routes through the Pacific Northwest, and I thought I knew every truck stop, every rest area, and every safe spot to park between Seattle and Portland. The forests up there are dense, ancient things that have been growing since before humans ever set foot in North America. Most of the time, they are beautiful in a way that takes your breath away. But sometimes, late at night, when you are alone with nothing but darkness pressing against your windows, those same forests can feel like they are hiding secrets that were never meant to be discovered. This happened to me last October during what should have been a routine delivery run from Tacoma to Eugene. I was hauling electronic components, nothing special, just another load that needed to get there on time. The weather had been acting up all week, with heavy rains making some of the mountain passes treacherous for big rigs. By the time I reached the halfway point of my route, I was running behind schedule and my logbook was showing that I needed to take my mandatory rest break whether I wanted to or not. I pulled into a truck stop called Pine Ridge Rest Area, about 40 miles south of Olympia. It was one of those older facilities that the state had built back in the 70s, tucked away in a grove of massive Douglas fir trees that towered over the parking area like ancient sentinels. During the day, the place had a rustic charm that made it popular with tourists and RV travelers. But at night, especially on a cold October evening with fog rolling in from the coast, it felt isolated and somehow vulnerable. The parking area was nearly empty when I arrived around 11:30 p.m. Just my rig and a couple of cars that probably belonged to late-shift workers heading home. The facility building was closed for the night, leaving only the vending machines and the exterior lighting to push back against the darkness that seemed to pour out of the surrounding forest like a living thing. I went through my usual routine, checking my load securement, doing a quick walk-around inspection and settling into my sleeper berth with a sandwich and a thermos of coffee. The plan was simple: get my required 8 hours of rest, then hit the road early to make up for lost time. I had done this same routine hundreds of times before at dozens of different locations. It should have been just another night. But from the moment I climbed into my bunk, something felt wrong. The forest around the rest area was too quiet. I am used to the normal sounds of wilderness at night: owls calling, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, maybe the distant howl of a coyote. But this silence was absolute, as if every living creature in those woods had suddenly decided to hold its breath. Even the wind, which had been gusting all evening, had died down to nothing. I tried to convince myself it was just the weather, maybe the approaching fog bank that was muffling the usual forest sounds. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to the oppressive quiet, I began to feel like I was being watched. It started as just a feeling, that prickly sensation you get on the back of your neck when someone is staring at you. I checked my mirrors, scanned the parking lot through my windows, even got up to look outside. Nothing. Just empty pavement and the wall of trees beyond the reach of the security lights. Around 1:15 a.m. I heard the first sound. It was subtle at first, just the faintest whisper of movement in the undergrowth at the edge of the tree line, the kind of sound a deer might make stepping carefully through fallen leaves. But there was something about the rhythm of it that did not seem quite right. It was too deliberate, too measured, like something was trying very hard not to be heard. I sat up in my bunk and pressed my face to the window, straining to see into the darkness beyond the parking lot lights. The fog had grown thicker, creating shifting curtains of gray that made it impossible to see more than 30 feet in any direction. But I could swear I caught a glimpse of movement, something dark and tall moving between the trees. Over the next hour, the sounds grew more frequent and more disturbing. Footsteps circling my truck at a distance, always staying just outside the pool of light cast by the security fixtures. The snap of twigs being broken underfoot, and once what sounded unmistakably like breathing, deep and ragged, coming from somewhere very close to my driver's side door. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed into the cab, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the windshield, I could see the fog swirling in unnatural patterns, as if something large was moving through it just beyond the range of my vision. I hit my high beams, flooding the area in front of my truck with brilliant white light. For just a moment, I saw it clearly. The figure stood about 50 yards away at the very edge where the pavement met the forest floor. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with impossibly long limbs and a gaunt frame that seemed to bend and twist in ways that human joints simply do not allow. Its skin looked pale and mottled in the glare of my headlights, stretched tight over protruding bones. But it was the eyes that made my blood turn to ice water. They reflected my headlight beams like an animal's eyes, but they were too large, too intelligent, and filled with a hunger that I felt in the deepest part of my soul. The moment my lights hit it, the thing moved, not running like a person or even like an animal, but flowing through the fog with a fluid motion that defied everything I thought I knew about how living things are supposed to move. Within seconds, it had vanished back into the tree line, leaving me staring at empty forest and wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. But I knew I had not imagined it. Every survival instinct I possessed was screaming that I was in mortal danger. I reached for my CB radio to call for help, but all I got was static. My cell phone showed no signal, which was not unusual in this remote area, but the timing felt ominous. I was completely cut off from the outside world, alone with whatever was stalking me through those ancient trees. The next few hours were the longest of my life. The thing, whatever it was, continued to circle my truck like a predator testing the defenses of its prey. I could hear it moving through the underbrush, sometimes close enough that I was certain it was just outside my door. Other times retreating deeper into the forest, only to return minutes later from a different direction. Around 3:30 a.m., it got bolder. I was lying in my sleeper berth, flashlight in one hand and my tire iron in the other, when I heard something that made my hair stand on end. Scratching sounds like claws being dragged across metal coming from somewhere above my head. The thing was on top of my trailer. The scratching moved slowly from the back of the trailer toward the front, each scrape of claw against metal sending vibrations through the entire rig. I could feel the truck swaying slightly under the weight of whatever was up there. When the sounds reached the area directly above my sleeper berth, they stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear breathing again. Slow, deliberate inhalations and exhalations that seemed far too large to come from human lungs. Then, without warning, something began tapping on the roof directly above where I lay. Not the random scratching of before, but a rhythmic pattern. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause. It was trying to communicate. Terror gave way to a surge of desperate courage. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed back into the cab, then rolled down my window and stuck my head out to look up at the roof of my trailer. The fog had thickened even more, but I could make out a dark shape hunched on the aluminum surface about 10 feet behind the cab. "What do you want?" I shouted into the night. The tapping stopped. For a long moment, the only sound was my own ragged breathing. Then the shape on my roof began to move again, sliding down the back of the trailer with the same unnatural fluidity I had witnessed earlier. Within seconds, it had dropped to the ground and disappeared into the fog. But I could still feel it watching me, waiting. As dawn finally began to break through the fog, painting the forest in shades of gray and pale yellow, I heard the sound of another vehicle pulling into the rest area. A state patrol car making its routine early morning check of the facility. I have never been so glad to see law enforcement in my entire life. The officer was a middle-aged woman named Sergeant Martinez, who had been patrolling this stretch of highway for 12 years. When I told her about my night, leaving out the more unbelievable details, she nodded grimly. "You are not the first trucker to report strange encounters at this location," she said, scanning the tree line with professional alertness. "We have had at least 6 similar reports over the past 2 years, always single drivers, always during the overnight hours." She walked around my truck, examining the scratches on the roof of my trailer. The metal was gouged in long parallel lines that looked like they had been made by claws, but claws much larger than any animal native to the Pacific Northwest. "What do you think made these marks?" I asked. Sergeant Martinez was quiet for a long moment, then looked directly at me. "Officially? Probably tree branches scraping against your trailer during the windstorm last night. Unofficially?" She paused, glancing back at the forest. "I have lived in this area my whole life, and there are things in these old woods that do not appear in any field guide or natural history book. My grandmother used to tell stories about creatures that the Quinault tribe called the Tall Walkers. Beings that were here long before the first European settlers, things that most people have forgotten how to see." Before I left that morning, Sergeant Martinez gave me some advice that I have never forgotten. "If you have to stop here again," she said, "do it during daylight hours. And if you see anything moving in those trees after dark, do not try to communicate with it. Some things are better left alone." I took her advice to heart. I have driven past Pine Ridge Rest Area dozens of times since that night, but I have never stopped there after sunset again. I have also started carrying more than just a tire iron for protection, though I doubt conventional weapons would do much good against something like what I encountered. Other truckers I have talked to have shared similar stories from remote areas throughout the Northwest. Sightings of tall, gaunt figures moving through old-growth forests. Encounters with things that walk upright but are definitely not human. Most drivers do not report these incidents officially, knowing how crazy they sound, but the stories spread through the trucking community anyway. I still run routes through the Pacific Northwest regularly. The money is good, and despite what happened, I love the rugged beauty of the region. But I have learned to be more careful about where I take my mandatory rest breaks. Some places are safe for travelers and others are not. The trick is knowing the difference before you find yourself alone in the dark with something that sees you not as a fellow living being, but as prey. The scratches on my trailer took 3 months to fade completely, and even now, almost a year later, I can still see faint marks if I know where to look. They serve as a reminder that there are still wild places in this world where humans are not the dominant species, where ancient things still hunt in the shadows between the trees. If you ever find yourself driving through the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest and you need to stop for the night, choose your parking spot carefully. Stay close to other travelers, keep your doors locked, and trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, if the forest gets too quiet, if you catch glimpses of movement in the darkness beyond your headlights, do not ignore those warning signs. Start your engine and drive away. Some encounters are not worth the risk, and some things that live in the deep woods are better left undisturbed. I am going to tell you about something that happened to me last September. Something that still makes me question everything I thought I knew about reality. My name is Matthew, and I have been driving cross-country routes for 22 years. In that time, I have seen just about everything the highway can throw at you. Blizzards, tornadoes, flash floods, and every kind of mechanical breakdown imaginable. But nothing in all those years of experience prepared me for what I encountered on a seemingly ordinary stretch of Interstate 35 through rural Iowa. I was hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Des Moines to Kansas City, a routine run that I had made dozens of times before. The weather was perfect, clear skies and mild temperatures, and I was making good time. I had left Des Moines around 8 p.m., planning to drive straight through the night and arrive in Kansas City by morning. It should have been one of those easy runs that remind you why you love life on the road. Everything was normal until around midnight. I was cruising through the heart of Iowa farmland, nothing but cornfields stretching endlessly on both sides of the highway. The radio was playing classic rock, my coffee was still hot, and I was settling into that comfortable rhythm that long-haul drivers know so well. That is when I noticed the first sign that something was wrong. I had just passed a road sign that read Osceola, 47 miles, when my GPS started acting strangely. The screen flickered for a moment, then showed a route that made no sense. According to the device, I was somehow driving north instead of south, and my destination had changed to some place called Nowhere, Iowa, that did not exist on any map. I figured it was just a technical glitch. GPS units malfunction all the time, especially in remote areas where satellite coverage can be spotty. I turned off the device and relied on my own knowledge of the route. After 22 years of driving, I knew Interstate 35 like the back of my hand. I could navigate it blindfolded, but then I passed the same road sign again. Osceola, 47 miles. Exactly the same distance, in exactly the same location. I checked my odometer and confirmed that I had been driving for over an hour since the first time I saw that sign. At 65 miles per hour, I should have covered at least 60 miles, putting me well past Osceola and deep into Missouri. But according to the sign, I had not made any progress at all. I tried to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe there were two identical signs, or maybe I had gotten turned around somehow without realizing it. But as I continued driving south, watching my mirrors and scanning the horizon for familiar landmarks, I began to accept the impossible truth. I was trapped in some kind of loop. Over the next few hours, I passed the same sequence of landmarks repeatedly. The same farmhouse with the red barn and the rusted silo, the same overpass carrying a county road across the interstate, the same billboard advertising a truck stop that, according to the sign, was only 15 miles away, but which I never seemed to reach. And always, every 53 miles exactly, the sign for Osceola promising it was 47 miles ahead. The worst part was the time. My dashboard clock was stuck at 3:17 a.m. No matter how long I drove, no matter how many miles I covered according to my odometer, the clock never advanced. My watch had stopped at the same time, and my cell phone showed no signal and a frozen display. Time itself had become meaningless in this stretch of highway that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of reality. I tried everything I could think of to break free from whatever was happening to me. I took the next exit ramp, only to find myself back on the highway heading south with no memory of how I got there. I pulled over and turned off my engine, thinking maybe I could wait it out, but when I started driving again, I was right back at the beginning of the loop. I even tried turning around and driving north, hoping to escape the trapped section of highway by going in the opposite direction. But after what felt like hours of northbound travel, I found myself approaching the same familiar landmarks from the south, as if the road had somehow twisted back on itself. The fuel gauge was the most disturbing thing of all. Logic said I should have been running out of diesel hours ago, but the needle never moved from the 3/4 tank mark where it had been when the loop began. The engine ran perfectly, consuming fuel that somehow replenished itself, defying every law of physics I understood. As the experience dragged on, I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. Sleep deprivation can cause hallucinations, and I had been driving for hours before the loop started. Maybe I had dozed off behind the wheel and was now trapped in some kind of nightmare brought on by exhaustion and stress. But everything felt too real to be a dream. I could smell the diesel fumes, feel the vibration of the engine through the steering wheel, taste the bitter coffee that never seemed to get cold. If this was a hallucination, it was the most complete and convincing one in medical history. I tried talking to other drivers on the CB radio, but all I got was static. Channel 19, which should have been busy with trucker chatter even in the middle of the night, was completely silent. It was as if I was the only person left in the world, trapped forever on this impossible stretch of highway that led nowhere and everywhere at the same time. The strangest part was how normal everything looked. This was not some hellish landscape or supernatural realm. It was just ordinary Iowa farmland under an ordinary star-filled sky. If not for the repetition and the frozen time, I might never have realized anything was wrong. The mundane nature of the trap made it somehow more terrifying than any obvious supernatural phenomenon would have been. Pure, what should have been dawn, but with the clock still frozen at 3:17 a.m. I had made the loop at least 15 times. I had memorized every detail of the 53-mile circuit, every fence post, every road sign, every slight curve in the asphalt. I knew exactly when to expect each landmark and could predict the view around every bend. That is when I started seeing the other vehicles. They appeared gradually, faintly at first, like mirages shimmering in the distance. Other trucks, cars, motorcycles, all traveling the same endless route. As I focused on them, they became more solid, more real. I could see the drivers, their faces blank and expressionless, staring straight ahead as they completed lap after lap of the same impossible circuit. I tried to signal them, flashing my lights and honking my horn, but they never responded. They seemed unaware of my presence, unaware of their situation, mechanically following the highway in a trance-like state that chilled me to the bone. I began to wonder how long they had been trapped here, whether some of them had been driving this loop for days, weeks, or even years. The thought that I might join them, that I might eventually lose awareness of my situation and become another mindless ghost driver, filled me with desperate panic. I had to find a way out before that happened, before whatever force was controlling this place claimed my consciousness as well as my physical presence. I started looking for details I had missed before, searching for some clue that might reveal the nature of my prison or provide a key to escape. That is when I noticed the mile markers were wrong. Instead of consecutive numbers marking distance along the interstate, they all showed the same number, 217. Mile marker 217 repeated endlessly, as if this section of highway existed in its own pocket of space-time. As I pondered this discovery, I began to notice that the landscape was not as identical as I had originally thought. There were subtle variations from loop to loop, small changes that suggested the repetition was not perfect. A fence might have one more post, a billboard might be slightly faded, a cloud formation might be different. It was as if I was experiencing multiple versions of the same stretch of highway, variations on a theme rather than exact duplicates. This realization gave me hope. If the loop was not perfect, if there were variations between iterations, then perhaps there was a version where the trap did not exist. I just had to find the right combination of factors that would allow me to break free. I started paying closer attention to these small differences, trying to map the variations and understand their pattern. After several more loops, I thought I detected a rhythm to the changes. The variations seemed to be building towards something, accumulating like static before a thunderstorm. Then, just as the eastern horizon should have been showing the first hints of dawn, everything changed. The frozen clock on my dashboard suddenly jumped to 6:45 a.m. The landscape around me shifted subtly, becoming more vivid and detailed. The other phantom vehicles faded away like smoke, leaving me alone on the highway once again. And there, ahead of me where the Osceola sign should have been, was a different marker entirely. Kansas City, 127 miles. I was free. I drove the remaining distance to Kansas City in a daze, unable to fully process what had happened to me. When I finally arrived at my destination, I discovered that my delivery log showed impossible timestamps. According to my paperwork, I had somehow covered the entire distance from Des Moines to Kansas City in negative time, arriving before I had left. I have never experienced anything like that night again, but I have heard similar stories from other drivers. Tales of highways that lead nowhere, of time behaving strangely on certain routes, of sections of road that seem to exist outside normal reality. Most drivers dismiss these stories as the products of exhaustion and imagination, but I know better now. There are places where the familiar rules do not apply, where the highway becomes something more than just a path between destinations. And if you find yourself driving through one of those places in the deep hours of the night, pay attention to the mile markers. If they stop making sense, if time seems to slow down or stop entirely, if the same landmarks keep appearing no matter how far you drive, do not panic. Keep driving, keep watching, and wait for the pattern to break. Eventually, if you are lucky, the road will remember where it is supposed to lead. I need to share what happened to me during my years driving the northern routes through Montana before I finally had to give up trucking altogether. My name is Joshua, and I spent 12 years hauling freight across the loneliest stretches of highway in America. I always preferred the night shift, loved the solitude and the peace that came with having the road to myself. But there are some kinds of solitude that no human being should ever have to experience, and I learned that lesson the hard way on the remote highways of Big Sky country. It started about 2 years ago on a routine run from Billings to Great Falls. I was carrying a load of construction equipment, heavy steel beams and concrete forms that made my rig handle like a loaded freight train. The weather was clear, temperature in the low 30s, and I was making good time on Highway 87 through the heart of Montana ranch country. Around 1:30 a.m., I switched on my CB radio to channel 19, hoping to catch some trucker chatter or maybe get an update on road conditions ahead. But instead of the usual mix of conversations and static, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice was calling my name. "Joshua," it said, crackling through the speaker with that distinctive CB distortion. "Joshua, can you hear me?" I grabbed the microphone, my hands suddenly shaking. In 12 years of trucking, no one had ever used my real name on the CB. Drivers go by their handles, their company call signs, anything but their actual names. It is an unwritten rule of the road. "Who is this?" I asked. "How do you know my name?" Static filled the channel for a long moment. Then the voice returned. It was different this time, older and more gravelly. "We have been waiting for you, Joshua. We have been waiting a long time." "Waiting for what? Who is we?" But the voice did not answer directly. Instead, it began describing my route in perfect detail. The mile markers I had just passed, the small towns sleeping in the darkness to my left and right, even the specific load I was carrying. Whoever was talking knew exactly where I was and where I was going. I tried switching to different channels, but the voices followed me. Channel 12, Channel 15, Channel 21. It did not matter. They were always there, always talking about me, always using my name in ways that made my skin crawl. Over the next hour, more voices joined the conversation. They spoke to each other about me as if I was not listening, discussing my route, my cargo, even personal details about my life that no stranger should have known. They talked about my divorce 3 years earlier, about the house I had lost in the settlement, about my ex-wife's new husband who worked at a bank in Missoula. "He is getting close to Lewistown," one voice said. It sounded like an old woman, her words stretched thin by age and static. "Should we tell him about the accident?" "What accident?" I demanded, keying my microphone. "What are you talking about?" "The one at mile marker 247, another voice replied. This one was younger, maybe a teenager, but there was something wrong with the way it spoke. The words came too slowly, like someone learning to talk for the first time. 3 cars. Very bad. You should slow down, Joshua." I looked at my odometer and realized with growing horror that mile marker 247 was only about 10 miles ahead of me. These voices, whoever they were giving me information about events that had not happened yet. I slowed down anyway, reducing my speed from 65 to 45 as I approached the area they had mentioned. Sure enough, just past mile marker 247, I saw the flashing lights of emergency vehicles scattered across both lanes of the highway. State police, ambulances, a fire truck with its ladder extended. 3 mangled cars were scattered across the median, and I could see paramedics working frantically around what looked like multiple casualties. I pulled over and tried to help, but the state trooper directing traffic waved me on. "Keep moving, driver," he shouted over the noise of the emergency equipment. "We have got this under control." As I drove past the accident scene, the voices on my CB started laughing. Not the normal laughter of human beings, but something hollow and echoing like sounds bouncing around inside an empty barrel. "Did you see, Joshua?" the old woman's voice asked. "Did you see what we showed you?" "How did you know?" I whispered into the microphone. How could you possibly know about that accident before it happened? We know lots of things, the teenage voice replied. We know about the truck stop in Great Falls where you always eat breakfast. We know about the waitress there, the one with the red hair who you think is pretty but who you are too shy to talk to. We know about the motel room you keep reserved for Tuesday nights, room 237 at the Roadway Inn. Every detail was correct. I had been eating at the same truck stop in Great Falls for 3 years. And there was indeed a red-haired waitress there who I had developed a crush on, but had never worked up the courage to approach. Room 237 at the Roadway Inn was my regular spot, reserved standing for my weekly runs through the area. "What do you want from me?" I asked. The voices went silent for several minutes, leaving only static and the distant murmur of other channels bleeding through. When they returned, there were more of them than before. I counted at least 7 distinct speakers, ranging from what sounded like a small child to an elderly man with a thick accent I could not identify. They began telling me stories. Stories about other truckers who had driven these same routes, drivers who had disappeared without explanation or been found dead in their cabs with no apparent cause. They spoke about accidents that had been arranged, about mechanical failures that had been orchestrated, about drivers who had been driven insane by voices on their CB radios. "We collect them," the child's voice explained with innocent enthusiasm. "The lonely ones, the ones who drive at night when nobody else is around. They come to live with us in the space between the channels. That is where we are now," the old man added. "In the static between frequencies, in the empty places where radio waves go to die. It is not so bad here, Joshua. There is no traffic, no deadlines, no dispatchers yelling at you about delivery times. Just the open road forever and always." I tried to turn off the radio, but it would not shut off. The voices continued even when I unplugged it from the power source, even when I removed the fuses from the electrical panel. They were not coming through the radio anymore, they were coming from inside my own head. As I continued driving toward Great Falls, the voices became more personal, more invasive. They began discussing my thoughts as I had them, commenting on my fears and reactions in real time. When I wondered if I was losing my mind, they laughed and assured me that sanity was overrated. When I considered pulling over and calling for help, they reminded me that my cell phone had no signal in this remote area. "There is nowhere to run, Joshua," the old woman said gently. "We are inside you now. We know everything you know, feel everything you feel. You belong to us." By the time I reached Great Falls, I was barely holding on to my sanity. The voices had been talking continuously for over 6 hours, describing every mile of road, every passing car, every thought that crossed my mind. They knew my social security number, my bank account balance, the name of my first dog, the recurring nightmare I had been having since childhood. I completed my delivery in a daze, unloaded my cargo with shaking hands, and checked into my usual room at the Roadway Inn. But the voices followed me there, commenting on the faded wallpaper, the broken air conditioning unit, the way I always slept on the left side of the bed. Over the next several weeks, the situation only got worse. The voices were with me constantly now, not just while I was driving, but every moment of every day. They critiqued my choice of breakfast cereal, discussed the quality of truck stop coffee, offered unwanted advice about my driving technique. Sleep became impossible because they would whisper continuously in my ears, telling stories about other drivers they had collected over the years. I tried everything I could think of to get rid of them. I saw doctors who prescribed medication for schizophrenia. I visited a priest who attempted an exorcism. I even consulted a psychiatrist who specialized in stress-related disorders in professional drivers. Nothing helped. The voices remained, as constant and inescapable as my own heartbeat. The final straw came 3 months later on another night run through Montana. I was hauling automotive parts from Bozeman to Helena when the voices began giving me directions that differed from my planned route. They insisted I take a series of back roads through the wilderness, promising they would show me something special if I followed their guidance. Against my better judgment, I obeyed. The alternative routes led me deeper into the mountains along increasingly narrow and treacherous roads that barely accommodated my large rig. Hours passed as I climbed switchbacks and navigated hairpin turns, following directions from voices that laughed and whispered encouragement with every mile. Finally, they directed me to stop at an overlook beside a deep canyon. As I set my air brakes, they explained what they wanted to show me. "Look down there, Joshua," the child's voice said excitedly. "Look at all the trucks." I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the edge of the overlook, then shined the beam down into the canyon below. What I saw made my knees buckle with terror. Hundreds of semi-trucks were scattered across the canyon floor, rusted and twisted wrecks that looked like they had been there for years or even decades. Some were partially buried by rock slides, others were burned out shells, but all of them showed the unmistakable signs of having driven straight off the cliff above. "These are our friends," the old woman's voice explained, "drivers who decided to join us permanently. It is very peaceful down there, Joshua. No more schedules, no more traffic, no more loneliness, just eternal rest in the company of fellow travelers." That was when I understood what the voices wanted from me. They were not just tormenting me for entertainment, they were recruiting me. Gradually wearing down my resistance until I would be willing to drive my truck off a cliff just to make them stop talking. I ran back to my rig, started the engine, and drove away from that overlook as fast as the winding mountain roads would allow. The voices screamed at me for hours, angry that I had rejected their invitation, but I kept driving until I reached the main highway again. The next morning, I turned in my resignation to the trucking company and walked away from the profession that had been my life for 12 years. The voices still talk to me sometimes, usually late at night when the world is quiet and I am alone with my thoughts. But they have less power over me now that I am not isolated on remote highways. Less ability to manipulate my reality when I am surrounded by other people in normal human conversation. I work at a warehouse now, loading and unloading trucks for other drivers. It is honest work, and it keeps me grounded in the normal world where voices come from human beings instead of empty frequencies in the radio spectrum. Sometimes I see the fear in a driver's eyes when they talk about the long-haul routes through Montana, and I want to warn them about what waits out there in the darkness between radio stations. But I know they would not believe me, just like I would not have believed anyone who had tried to warn me. So I keep my story to myself, and I count myself lucky to have escaped the fate of those drivers whose trucks rest forever in that hidden canyon. But on quiet nights when the wind is blowing just right, I can still hear them calling my name from somewhere far away, promising me that the road is waiting whenever I am ready to return. I need to tell someone about what happened to me at a truck stop in Arizona last year. It is something that still gives me nightmares, and I hope sharing it might help other female drivers stay safe out there. My name is Brittany, and I have been driving professionally for 7 years. Being a woman in this industry means you learn to be extra careful, extra aware, and extra prepared for situations that male drivers might never have to face. I was hauling a load of textiles from Los Angeles to Phoenix, a routine run that I had made dozens of times before. It was early November and the desert nights were getting cold, so I was looking forward to a hot meal and maybe a shower before getting my mandatory rest. I pulled into a large truck stop just outside Flagstaff around 9:30 p.m., one of those 24-hour places with a restaurant, convenience store, and full-service facilities. The parking lot was about half full, which was normal for that time of night. I found a spot near the back where I could park my rig without blocking anyone, but close enough to the main building that I would feel safe walking back and forth. As a woman driver, you learn to think about these things: lighting, visibility, escape routes. They become second nature after a while. I went through my usual routine, secured my load, did a quick inspection of my equipment, then headed inside to grab dinner and use the facilities. The truck stop was busy but not crowded, filled with the usual mix of drivers, travelers, and local workers stopping by for coffee and snacks. I noticed him while I was ordering food at the restaurant counter. He was sitting alone in a booth near the window, a thin man in his 40s with greasy hair and clothes that looked like they had not been washed in weeks. What caught my attention was not his appearance, but the way he was watching me. His eyes followed my every movement as I ordered my meal, paid at the register, and found a table on the opposite side of the dining area. I tried to ignore him, focusing on my food and the trucking magazine I had brought in with me. But every time I looked up, he was still staring. Not the casual glance you might give to another person in a restaurant, but an intense, predatory stare that made my skin crawl. When I finished eating and got up to leave, he got up too. When I stopped at the convenience store to buy coffee for the road, he lingered nearby, pretending to browse the magazine rack while keeping me in his peripheral vision. When I walked back out to the parking lot, he followed at a distance. My truck was parked in a row with several others, and as I approached it, I could see him reflected in the side mirrors, hanging back about 50 yards, but definitely following me. Every instinct I had developed over 7 years of solo driving was screaming warnings. I climbed into my cab and immediately locked the doors, then sat there for a few minutes watching him in my mirrors. He had stopped next to a pickup truck several spaces away and was making a show of checking his tires, but his attention was clearly still focused on me. I considered driving away immediately, finding another place to take my rest break, but federal regulations required me to log 8 hours of off-duty time before I could legally drive again. I was already pushing close to my maximum allowable hours, and I could not afford to get pulled over for a logbook violation. Instead, I decided to wait him out. Surely he would get tired of whatever game he was playing and move on to bother someone else, or better yet, just leave entirely. I settled into my sleeper berth with a book and tried to relax, checking my mirrors periodically to see if he was still out there. He was. For over an hour, he stayed near that pickup truck, sometimes sitting on the tailgate, sometimes walking around the vehicle, but always positioned where he could keep an eye on my truck. Other drivers came and went around us, but he seemed oblivious to everything except me. Around 11:30 p.m., I finally saw him walk back toward the main building, and I allowed myself to relax a little. Maybe he had given up. Maybe he was just some harmless weirdo who got his kicks from making women uncomfortable. I closed my curtains, turned off my interior lights, and tried to get some sleep. I was awakened around 2:15 a.m. by the sound of footsteps on gravel, slow and deliberate, circling my truck. I lay perfectly still in my bunk, listening as the footsteps moved from the front of my rig to the driver's side, then around to the back of the trailer, then up the passenger side. Whoever was out there was taking their time, studying my truck, looking for weaknesses. The footsteps stopped near my passenger door, and I could hear the soft sound of someone breathing heavily just outside. Then came the gentle rattle of a door handle being tested. My passenger door was locked, but the sound of someone trying to open it made my blood turn to ice. I reached for my cell phone to call 911, but realized I had no signal. The truck stop was in one of those dead zones where cellular coverage was spotty at best. I was on my own. The person outside moved to my driver's door and tested that handle as well. When it did not open, I heard what sounded like metal tools being scraped against the lock mechanism. He was trying to break into my truck. I grabbed the tire iron I kept under my bunk and crept forward to the cab, staying low and trying not to make any noise that would alert him to the fact that I was awake. Through a gap in my curtains, I could see a figure hunched beside my driver's door, working on the lock with what looked like a set of lockpicks. That is when I realized this was not some random opportunist. This was someone who had come prepared, someone who had done this before. The way he moved, the tools he carried, the patience he showed, everything about his behavior suggested experience and planning. I was trapped. If I tried to start my truck and drive away, he would hear the engine and might panic, possibly becoming violent. If I stayed where I was, he might succeed in getting the door open, and I would be cornered in my sleeper berth with nowhere to run. I decided to take the offensive. I moved to my driver's seat as quietly as possible, then suddenly flipped on all my exterior lights and laid on the horn. The blast of sound shattered the night silence, and I saw the figure outside stumble backward in surprise. "Get away from my truck!" I screamed through the closed window. "I am calling the police." The man looked up at me, and in the harsh glare of my headlights, I could see his face clearly for the first time. His eyes were wild and unfocused, his expression a mixture of rage and frustration. He was not just some harmless creep. This was someone dangerous, someone who had been planning to do serious harm. Instead of running away, he moved toward my driver's door again, this time producing what looked like a crowbar. He was going to try to force his way in. I kept the horn blaring while I reached for my CB radio, broadcasting on channel 19 for any driver who might be listening. "Mayday, mayday, this is a female driver under attack at the Flagstaff truck stop. I need immediate assistance. Repeat, I need help now." The response was immediate. Several drivers came back over the radio, and I could see lights coming on in other trucks around the parking lot. Within minutes, at least 4 other truckers were walking toward my location, some carrying flashlights and tire irons of their own. The man with the crowbar saw them coming and finally decided to retreat. He ran toward the pickup truck he had been lurking near earlier, but instead of getting in it, he disappeared into the darkness beyond the parking lot lights. One of the drivers who had come to help tried to follow him, but he had vanished into the desert scrub. The state police arrived about 20 minutes later, followed by the local sheriff's department. They took my statement and examined my truck for evidence of the attempted break-in, finding scratches around both door locks that confirmed someone had indeed tried to pick them. The detective who handled the case told me that I was lucky to have fought back when I did. Over the past 18 months, there had been at least 6 similar incidents at truck stops throughout Arizona and New Mexico, all targeting female drivers who were resting alone. In 3 of those cases, the attacker had succeeded in gaining entry to the cab, and the outcomes had been tragic. They never caught the man who attacked me that night. The pickup truck he had been using turned out to be stolen, abandoned in a parking lot in Flagstaff the next morning. Security cameras at the truck stop had malfunctioned conveniently, providing no useful footage of the incident. I completed my run to Phoenix the next day, but I have never felt the same level of security while taking my rest breaks. I installed additional locks on my doors, carry multiple communication devices in case my cell phone fails, and always park as close to the main building as possible. I also invested in a personal alarm system that connects directly to emergency services. The experience taught me that the dangers female drivers face on the road go beyond mechanical breakdowns and bad weather. There are predators out there who specifically target women in the trucking industry, taking advantage of our isolation and the remote locations where we are required to rest. I have shared my story with other female drivers whenever possible, hoping to help them stay alert and prepared. We look out for each other in this industry, sharing information about safe parking spots and dangerous locations, but it should not be our responsibility alone to stay safe. Truck stops need better security, better lighting, and better surveillance systems. Law enforcement needs to take these attacks seriously and coordinate their efforts across state lines. And trucking companies need to provide their female drivers with the resources and training necessary to protect themselves. Until those changes happen, we have to rely on our own awareness and preparation. Trust your instincts if something feels wrong. Do not hesitate to call for help or make noise if you feel threatened. And remember that your safety is more important than any delivery schedule or company policy. I still drive solo routes, and I still love the freedom and independence that comes with life on the road. But I am more careful now, more aware of the risks that come with being a woman alone in remote places. The predators are out there waiting for opportunities, and the only way to stay safe is to make sure they never get the chance to strike. What I am about to tell you happened to me 6 months ago on what should have been a routine regional run through rural Kentucky. I need to share this because I still do not understand what occurred that night, and I hope maybe someone else has experienced something similar. My name is Samantha, and I have been driving the same routes through Kentucky and Tennessee for 4 years. I know these roads like I know my own reflection, every curve and hill, every truck stop and way station. But on this particular night, the familiar became alien, and I found myself trapped in a version of reality that still haunts my dreams. I was hauling auto parts from Louisville to Nashville, a route I had driven at least 50 times before. It was a clear October evening, temperature in the low 60s, perfect driving weather. I left Louisville around 7 p.m., planning to make the delivery by midnight and then catch some sleep before heading back north the next morning. Everything was normal for the first hour. I cruised south on Interstate 65, listening to country music and watching the sunset paint the Kentucky countryside in shades of gold and amber. I passed all the familiar landmarks: the Jim Beam Distillery, the exit for Bardstown, the rolling hills dotted with horse farms that made this part of the state famous. But somewhere around the 8:30 mark, things started to feel different. The first sign that something was wrong came when I passed a billboard that I had never seen before. It was advertising a restaurant called the Crossroads Diner and claimed it was the next exit just 2 miles ahead. I had driven this stretch of highway dozens of times, and there was no restaurant at that exit, just a small gas station and a few houses scattered through the woods. I figured it was a new business, something that had opened since my last run through the area. But as I approached the exit, I could see that the landscape around it had changed too. The gas station was gone, replaced by a cluster of buildings that looked older, more weathered, as if they had been there for decades instead of being newly constructed. I decided to take the exit and check out this mysterious diner, curious about how I could have missed such a significant change to my regular route. But when I turned off the interstate, the exit ramp led to a road I did not recognize. Instead of the narrow county road that should have been there, I found myself on a 4-lane highway that stretched into the distance through terrain that looked subtly wrong. The hills were the right shape, and the trees were the right species, but everything seemed slightly more vivid, more detailed than it should have been. It was like looking at a high-definition version of reality, too sharp and clear to be entirely natural. The Crossroads Diner turned out to be a classic 1950s-style establishment, complete with neon signs and chrome fixtures that gleamed under parking lot lights. The parking lot was full of vehicles, but they were all cars and pickup trucks from decades past. Classic Chevrolets and Fords from the 60s and 70s, all in perfect condition as if they had just rolled off the showroom floor. I parked my rig and walked inside, hoping to find someone who could explain what was happening. The diner was packed with customers, all dressed in clothing styles that seemed to belong to previous eras. Men in work clothes and fedoras, women in dresses and hairdos that I had only seen in old photographs. They all looked up when I entered, and their faces showed polite curiosity but no recognition that anything about my appearance was unusual or out of place. I ordered coffee from a waitress who could have stepped out of a Norman Rockwell painting, then asked her about the interstate construction that must have happened recently. She looked at me with genuine confusion. "Interstate?" she said. "Honey, there is not any interstate around here, just the old state highway that runs north to Louisville and south to Nashville. Has been that way for as long as I can remember." I tried to explain that I had just driven off Interstate 65, but she insisted there was no such road. Other customers joined the conversation, all of them agreeing that the main highway through the area was State Route 31, a two-lane road that had been the primary north-south corridor for decades. Feeling increasingly disoriented, I paid for my coffee and walked back outside. My truck was still there in the parking lot, looking massive and modern next to the vintage automobiles surrounding it. But when I climbed into the cab and tried to navigate back to the interstate, I discovered that my GPS was showing locations that did not make sense. According to the device, I was in a town called Millerville, Kentucky, population 2,847. But there was no such town on any map I had ever seen. The GPS was showing roads and highways that differed completely from what I knew to be the actual layout of the area. I decided to ignore the GPS and navigate by memory, driving what I thought should be the route back to Interstate 65. But after 20 minutes of driving through countryside that looked familiar yet subtly different, I found myself on a two-lane highway marked as Route 31, heading south toward Nashville. This was impossible. Route 31 was a historical designation that had been replaced by the interstate system decades ago. Yet here I was, driving on a road that officially no longer existed through a landscape that seemed to be a mixture of the Kentucky I knew and some alternate version that had developed along different lines. Other vehicles on Route 31 were a mixture of vintage cars and more modern vehicles like mine. The drivers I could see looked normal enough, but there was something in their expressions, a kind of resigned acceptance that suggested they were as confused as I was, but had given up trying to understand their situation. I tried my CB radio, hoping to contact other truck drivers who might explain what was happening. Channel 19 was active, but the conversations I heard were strange. Drivers were discussing routes and destinations that did not exist, talking about companies I had never heard of, referencing trucking regulations that bore no resemblance to current federal requirements. "Breaker 19, this is Moondog eastbound on Route 31, one voice said. "Anyone know if the scales are running at the Millerville checkpoint?" "That is a negative, Moondog," another voice replied. "Haven't seen a scale house on this route in 15 years. You might be thinking of the old Interstate 65 corridor, but that got shut down after the big accident back in '73. I keyed my microphone, hoping to get clarification. "This is a southbound driver looking for Interstate 65, I said. "Can anyone give me directions to get back to the main highway?" The channel went silent for a long moment. Then the first voice came back. "Driver, there is no Interstate 65 in this area. Route 31 is the main north-south highway through central Kentucky. Has been since they built it back in 1926. You feeling okay out there?" I was not feeling okay. I was beginning to suspect that I had somehow driven into a version of Kentucky where the interstate highway system had never been built, where the old federal highways still carried the bulk of long-distance traffic, where small towns like Millerville had continued to thrive instead of being bypassed and forgotten. For the next 3 hours, I drove south on Route 31 through this alternate Kentucky, passing through towns that should not have existed and seeing landmarks that had been demolished or replaced decades ago in my version of reality. Everything was slightly different, slightly wrong, as if I was looking at the world through a distorted mirror. The worst part was the growing realization that other people around me seemed to accept this reality as normal. The drivers I spoke to on the CB, the customers at gas stations where I stopped for directions, even the state police officers I saw patrolling the highway, all acted as if this version of Kentucky was the only one that had ever existed. Around 2 a.m., I finally saw signs for Nashville ahead. But when I reached the city limits, I discovered that this was not the Nashville I knew. The skyline was different, dominated by buildings that looked like they belonged to the 1960s rather than the 21st century. The interstate loop around the city was absent, replaced by a network of state highways that wound through neighborhoods I did not recognize. I managed to find my delivery destination, but the warehouse was in a location that should have been occupied by a shopping center in my version of reality. The receiving clerk seemed surprised to see me, claiming they had not been expecting a delivery until the following week. But he accepted my load anyway, and I got my paperwork signed without any major complications. By dawn, I was exhausted and confused, desperate to find my way back to the reality I knew. I started driving north on what the local signs insisted was Route 31, retracing my path from the night before. But somewhere around sunrise, as I was passing through an area that looked like it should have been near Bardstown, the landscape began to shift again. Gradually, the vintage buildings and classic cars gave way to the modern Kentucky I recognized. Route 31 became Interstate 65. The small towns resumed their familiar names, and my GPS began showing locations that matched my memory of the area. By the time I reached Louisville, everything was back to normal. The Crossroads Diner was gone, replaced by the small gas station I remembered. The exit looked exactly as it should have, and there was no sign that the events of the previous night had ever occurred. I completed my return trip without incident, but I have never been able to explain what happened during those 8 hours in alternate Kentucky. I have researched the history of the area, looking for references to towns like Millerville or restaurants like the Crossroads Diner, but I have found nothing that matches my experience. Other drivers I have spoken to have shared similar stories, tales of roads that lead to places that should not exist, of getting lost in familiar territory and finding themselves in versions of reality where history unfolded differently. Most of them dismiss these experiences as the products of fatigue and stress, but I know what I saw and experienced that night. I still drive the Louisville to Nashville route regularly, but I have never encountered that alternate version of Kentucky again. Sometimes late at night when I am driving through the more remote stretches of highway, I wonder if those roads are still there, existing parallel to the ones we know, accessible only under certain circumstances that I do not understand. The experience has made me more aware of the strangeness that can lurk beneath the surface of familiar places. There are layers to reality that most of us never see, alternate versions of the world that exist alongside the one we think we know. For truck drivers who spend their lives traveling between distant places, the boundaries between these realities may be thinner, easier to cross when conditions are right. I have learned to pay closer attention to the small details during my runs, watching for signs that the world around me is beginning to shift into something different. Because if it happened once, it could happen again, and next time I want to be prepared for the journey into the spaces between what is real and what should be impossible. I have to tell someone about what has been happening to me for the past 8 months. Every time I think about quitting trucking altogether, something tells me I need to share this story. Maybe to warn other drivers, or maybe just to convince myself that I am not losing my mind. My name is Taylor, and I have been driving solo runs across the desert Southwest for 6 years. I always preferred the night shift, loved the solitude and the way the highway looks under starlight. But now the darkness holds something I never wanted to find, and I am not sure I can ever escape it. It started last January on a routine run from Phoenix to Albuquerque. I was hauling electronics, expensive stuff that required careful handling and tight security. The weather was perfect, clear and cold, with temperatures in the low 40s and unlimited visibility. I had left Phoenix around 10 p.m., planning to drive straight through and arrive in Albuquerque by dawn. Everything was normal for the first few hours. I cruised east on Interstate 40, listening to late-night talk radio and watching the desert landscape roll past under my headlights. The highway was mostly empty except for the occasional car or long-haul trucker heading in the opposite direction. Around 1:30 a.m., somewhere between Flagstaff and Winslow, I first noticed the figure in my mirrors. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe the reflection of my own interior lighting or a shadow cast by my load straps. But as I watched more carefully, I began to see that there was something distinctly human-shaped moving in the darkness behind my trailer. It appeared to be a tall, thin person dressed in dark clothing walking at a steady pace that somehow kept exact time with my truck's speed. Even though I was traveling at 70 miles per hour, the figure maintained its position about 50 yards behind my trailer. Never falling back, never catching up, just maintaining that precise distance like it was tethered to my rig by an invisible rope. I slowed down to 60, then 55, thinking maybe I would lose whatever optical illusion was creating this effect. But the figure slowed down with me, maintaining that exact same distance. When I sped back up to 75, it matched my speed perfectly, never breaking stride, never showing any sign of effort despite the impossible pace. I tried changing lanes, thinking maybe it was some kind of reflection from a vehicle in the opposite direction. But the figure followed me across the highway, still walking steadily behind my trailer as if the lane change had never occurred. I grabbed my CB radio and called out to any drivers who might be in the area. Breaker 19, this is an eastbound driver on I-40 near Winslow. Anyone else seeing anything strange out here tonight? The response came back immediately. Negative, eastbound. Highway looks clear from here. You feeling okay out there? I wanted to describe what I was seeing, but I knew how crazy it would sound. Oh, person walking behind my truck at highway speeds, following me across lane changes, matching my speed no matter how fast or slow I drove. No one would believe it, and I was beginning to wonder if I should believe it myself. For the next hour, the figure continued its impossible pursuit. I watched it in my mirrors, trying to make out details, but it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. No matter how I adjusted my mirrors or turned on additional lights, I could never see its face or any specific features. It was just a dark shape in the rough outline of a person, walking with mechanical precision through the desert night. Around 3 a.m., I pulled into a truck stop near Winona, hoping to break whatever spell was holding this apparition to my truck. I parked under the brightest lights I could find and immediately jumped out to check behind my trailer. Nothing. The pavement was empty, showing no sign that anyone had been walking there. But as I climbed back into my cab and checked my mirrors, the figure was there again, standing motionless about 50 yards behind my truck, waiting. I tried to ignore it, went inside the truck stop, bought coffee, used the restroom, called my dispatcher to check in. But when I came back outside 20 minutes later, it was still there in exactly the same position, as if it had never moved. I completed the rest of my run to Albuquerque with the figure following behind me every mile. When I finally reached my destination and backed up to the loading dock, I watched in my mirrors as it simply faded away like smoke, vanishing into the dawn light. I hoped that would be the end of it, that whatever I had encountered was tied to that specific route or that particular night. But I was wrong. Over the following weeks, the figure began appearing on other runs, other highways, always in my mirrors, always maintaining that exact distance behind my trailer. It did not matter where I was driving or what time of day it was. Desert highways, mountain passes, city streets, the figure was always there. During daylight runs, it appeared as a heat mirage, shimmering in the distance but clearly maintaining the shape of a walking person. At night, it was a solid shadow moving through darkness with inhuman persistence. The worst part was how it began to affect my driving. I found myself constantly checking my mirrors, so obsessed with watching the figure that I started missing turns, running red lights, even rear-ending another vehicle at a stop sign, because I was staring at my mirrors instead of watching the road ahead. Other drivers started commenting on my erratic behavior. My dispatcher received complaints about my sudden lane changes, my inconsistent speeds, my failure to respond to radio calls because I was too focused on whatever was behind me. I tried switching to day runs, thinking maybe the figure would be less visible in sunlight, but it adapted, becoming more translucent but still clearly present, still walking, with that same mechanical stride that matched my speed exactly. I tried taking vacation time, staying home for 2 weeks, hoping to break whatever connection had formed between me and this impossible follower. But the first time I got back in a truck, there it was again, waiting patiently behind my trailer as if it had never left. That was when it started getting into my cab. I first noticed it during a night run through New Mexico in late March. I was checking my mirrors as usual when I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. When I turned to look, there was nothing there, but I could swear I had seen a dark shape seated in my passenger seat for just a split second. Over the following weeks, these sightings became more frequent and more distinct. The figure would appear in my passenger seat, always facing forward, never moving or speaking, just sitting there with that same light-absorbing darkness that made it impossible to see any details. At first, it would only appear for a few seconds before fading away, but gradually the visitations lasted longer. Minutes at a time, then entire hours where I would be driving with this impossible passenger sitting silently beside me. I tried talking to it, asking what it wanted, why it was following me, but it never responded, never acknowledged my presence, never gave any indication that it was aware of my existence. It just sat there, a hole in reality shaped like a person, accompanying me on my endless journeys across the American Southwest. The real terror began when it started reaching for the steering wheel. The first time it happened, I thought I was hallucinating from exhaustion. I was driving through the Arizona desert around 2 a.m. when I saw in my peripheral vision a dark hand extending toward my steering wheel. When I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there. But I could feel a cold presence beside me, could sense something that wanted to take control of my truck. Over the following weeks, these attempts became more frequent and more aggressive. The figure would reach for my steering wheel, my gear shift, my brake pedal, trying to influence my driving in ways that would have been catastrophic if it had succeeded. I started wearing gloves and long sleeves, thinking maybe physical barriers would help, but the cold touch of its presence could penetrate any material. When it reached for the controls, I could feel ice-cold fingers brushing against my hands, could sense an alien intelligence trying to override my own will. The worst incident happened 2 months ago on a night run between Tucson and El Paso. I was driving through a particularly remote stretch of desert when the figure appeared in my passenger seat and immediately began reaching for the steering wheel. This time, instead of just brushing against my hands, it seemed to partially merge with my own movements, creating a horrible sensation of shared control. For several terrifying minutes, I was not entirely in command of my own truck. The steering wheel would turn slightly without my input. The speed would increase or decrease according to some alien will that was not my own. I fought against this influence with every ounce of strength I possessed, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white, forcing my foot to maintain pressure on the accelerator despite the creature's attempts to make me brake or accelerate. Finally, I managed to pull over at a rest area and stop the truck. The moment I set the air brakes, the figure vanished, leaving me alone and shaking in my cab. That was when I realized that this thing, whatever it was, did not just want to follow me. It wanted to possess me, to take control of my truck and use it for purposes I could not comprehend. I have been trying to find ways to get rid of it ever since. I have consulted priests, paranormal investigators, even a Native American shaman who specializes in desert spirits. Some of them claim to sense the presence when I describe it, but none of them have been able to remove it or explain what it wants. The shaman told me that certain places in the desert are thin spots where the boundary between our world and others becomes permeable. He suggested that I might have picked up this follower by driving through one of these areas during a time when conditions were right for such contact. But knowing what caused it does not help me get rid of it. The figure is still there, still following behind my truck on every run, still appearing in my passenger seat when conditions are right. And I can feel it getting stronger, more solid, more capable of influencing the physical world. I am afraid that soon it will be able to take complete control, to use my truck as a weapon or to drive it to some destination that exists in its reality rather than mine. When that happens, I do not think I will be coming back. I have started carrying a small video camera in my cab, trying to document these encounters, but the figure never appears on film. It exists only in mirrors and peripheral vision, in the spaces between what is real and what should be impossible. If you are a driver reading this, be careful about the routes you choose, especially through remote desert areas where the landscape has remained unchanged for thousands of years. There are things out there that are older than our highways, older than our civilization, and some of them are still hungry for contact with the modern world. Pay attention to your mirrors, but not too much attention. If you start seeing things that should not be there, do not try to investigate or understand them. Just keep driving, stay focused on the road ahead, and hope that whatever is following you eventually loses interest and moves on to someone else. Because once it attaches itself to you, once it decides that you belong to it, there may be no way to break free. And in the end, you might find yourself becoming a passenger in your own life, watching helplessly as something else takes control of the wheel. Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we uncover 8 of the most disturbing true small-town horror stories that shattered communities and destroyed lives forever. These accounts are not pulled from internet forums or secondhand retellings, but from the personal testimonies of individuals whose quiet lives became living nightmares. Each story reveals the darkness hiding behind small-town facades, from predators using local Facebook groups to hunt their victims, to investment schemes that were covers for something far more sinister. We have mechanic Anthony, whose late-night work shifts put him in a serial killer's crosshairs, teacher Rachel, whose evening walk home became a targeted attack, and Ranger Brianna, whose forest encounters revealed something inhuman stalking her community. The testimonies have been carefully verified through police reports and court documents, ensuring every detail maintains its disturbing authenticity, while names and specific locations have been altered to protect those who survived these ordeals. If you have not yet subscribed to Buried Files, join our community of truth seekers and activate the notification bell so you never miss when we expose the horror hiding in plain sight. Leave a comment below sharing your own small-town experiences, or tell us which story disturbed you most deeply. I never thought my evening walk home would put me in the crosshairs of organized predators. I was 28, teaching 3rd grade at Millerville Elementary in our small Montana town, population just under 4,000 people. The kind of place where parents still let their children ride bicycles after dark, and where the biggest crime of the year was usually teenagers spray painting the water tower. My life was simple but fulfilling. teaching bright 8-year-olds during the day and hiking the mountain trails that surrounded our valley on weekends. That particular Friday evening in late August, I had met my friend Brianna at Murphy's Diner for our monthly dinner, something we had been doing since we both moved to Millerville 3 years earlier. She worked as a park ranger at the state recreation area, and I always enjoyed hearing her stories about wildlife encounters and the tourists who thought they could hike 15 miles in sandals. The diner sat on Main Street, only about a 15-minute walk from my rental house on Oakwood Drive. I always enjoyed the stroll home, especially on warm summer nights when the air smelled like pine and the mountains created dramatic silhouettes against the darkening sky. Around 9:30 p.m., I hugged Brianna goodbye in the parking lot and started my walk home along Hillcrest Road. The street was poorly lit, just a few street lamps every couple hundred feet. But I had walked this route countless times and knew every pothole and crack in the sidewalk. The Hendersons' golden retriever would usually bark from behind their fence when I passed. Mrs. Foster's wind chimes would tinkle in her front yard, and old Mr. Peterson would often be sitting on his porch, raising a hand in greeting. That night, though, most houses were already dark, their occupants probably watching television or getting ready for bed. I remember feeling completely at peace, thinking about the lesson plans I needed to finish that weekend, humming some tune I had heard on the radio earlier. The air was still warm but carried that hint of approaching fall. And I was wearing my favorite sundress, the yellow one with tiny flowers that my mother had given me for my birthday. I was about halfway home, passing the stretch where Hillcrest curves slightly near the old oak tree that everyone calls the wishing tree because kids have been tying ribbons to it for decades. The sidewalk ended there, so I had to walk on the shoulder of the road, but there was usually so little traffic at that hour that it never bothered me. That is when I heard the engine. Not the steady hum of a car maintaining speed, but this aggressive, uneven roaring that kept surging and dropping like someone was randomly stomping on the gas pedal. I turned my head to look back and saw headlights weaving across both lanes about 200 yards away, moving way too fast for this narrow road. The vehicle, a dark pickup truck based on the height of the lights, kept drifting from one side to the other, tires squealing every time it corrected too hard. My first thought was not even about my own safety. I actually worried the driver might hit the wishing tree, which sounds ridiculous now. But that tree had been a landmark in our community for generations. But then I realized the truck was accelerating, really gunning it on this straight stretch, and it was veering toward my side of the road. The headlights swung wide to the left, then overcorrected sharply to the right, heading straight for the shoulder where I was walking. Everything happened in maybe 3 seconds, but my brain recorded it in this strange, stretched-out way. I tried to jump toward the drainage ditch, but my sandal caught on a piece of loose gravel and I stumbled. The truck was so close I could see the bugs splattered on the grill, could smell the hot engine and burnt rubber. The driver, I glimpsed his face for just an instant through the windshield, had this slack, unfocused expression, his mouth hanging open, one hand loosely on the wheel while the other held what looked like a beer bottle. His eyes were not even looking at the road. They were glazed, staring at nothing, but there was something calculated about his positioning that made my blood freeze even in that split second of terror. This was not just drunk driving. This was deliberate. The impact came from behind and to my left, the truck's front bumper catching me at hip level and launching me forward like I weighed nothing. I remember the sensation of flying, my dress billowing up, one sandal flying off, and thinking absurdly that I needed to cover myself, that people might see my underwear. Then I hit the pavement hard, my right shoulder taking the initial impact before I rolled and skidded across the asphalt. The pain did not register immediately. There was just this overwhelming wrongness, like my body had become a jumbled puzzle with pieces forced into the wrong spots. I could taste copper in my mouth and feel wetness spreading across the right side of my face. The truck had not stopped. I heard it screech around the next curve, metal scraping against something, probably the guardrail, before the engine noise faded into the distance. I tried to move to get up, but my right leg would not respond at all. When I looked down, I saw it was bent at an angle that made no anatomical sense, my foot facing completely backward. My right arm was trapped underneath me, and when I tried to pull it free, white-hot agony shot through my shoulder and chest. I could hear myself making these awful whimpering sounds like a wounded animal, but I could not stop. The yellow sundress my mother had given me was torn and soaking up blood from a dozen different places, the tiny flowers disappearing under spreading red stains. I lay there on the warm asphalt, feeling it burning against my exposed skin, trying to call for help, but only managing these raspy whispers. My phone had been in my purse, which was now scattered somewhere in the darkness. I could see my wallet about 10 feet away, my driver's license facing up, and somehow that detail felt important, like I needed people to know who I was when they found me. The first car to arrive was driven by Anthony, a local farmer who had been coming home late from checking on his cattle. He found me around 10:15 p.m. and immediately called for an ambulance while covering me with a blanket from his truck. "Do not try to move," he kept saying, though moving was the last thing my body wanted to do anyway. The paramedics arrived within 12 minutes, a response time that probably saved my life given the internal injuries I had sustained. They stabilized me on scene before transporting me to the regional hospital in Billings. A 40-minute helicopter ride that I barely remember except for the steady thrum of rotors and someone holding my hand. The next few days were a haze of surgeries and pain medication, but one conversation stands out with crystal clarity. Detective Benjamin Walsh from the state police came to interview me while I was still in intensive care, asking detailed questions about the truck, the driver, and whether I had noticed anything unusual in the days leading up to the incident. "This was not random," Detective Walsh explained during our second meeting. "We have been tracking a pattern of similar incidents across 3 states. Young women, usually teachers or healthcare workers, walking alone in small mountain communities. The profile is very specific, and the targeting appears to be deliberate. The investigation revealed that my attack was part of a coordinated operation involving at least 4 men, who had been systematically targeting isolated women in small towns throughout Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. They would scout communities for weeks, identifying women who walked alone at predictable times, learning their routines, and planning attacks that appeared to be drunk driving accidents. The truck that hit me had been stolen from a ranch outside Missoula 2 days earlier. The driver, whose name was Ryan Marcus, had a lengthy criminal record including assault and trafficking charges. But most terrifyingly, they found detailed files in his hotel room containing photographs of me taken over several weeks, including images of my classroom, my house, and my regular walking route. Ryan and his accomplices had been in Millerville for over a month, posing as seasonal construction workers while gathering intelligence on potential victims. They had targeted me specifically because my evening walks were predictable and because the stretch of Hillcrest Road near the wishing tree provided the perfect location for an attack that could be dismissed as a drunk driving accident. The FBI arrested the entire network 6 weeks after my attack, preventing what investigators believe would have been escalating violence against women throughout the region. Ryan received 25 years in federal prison. His accomplices got shorter sentences in exchange for cooperation, revealing a trafficking operation that had been using small towns as hunting grounds for victims who could be easily isolated and transported. I spent 4 months in physical therapy learning to walk again with a permanently damaged right leg and ongoing nerve damage in my shoulder. The school district held my position, and my students made cards that covered every wall of my hospital room. but I knew I could not return to Millerville. The idea of walking those streets again, of passing the wishing tree where my life had nearly ended, was more than I could psychologically handle. I moved to Seattle 6 months after the attack, taking a teaching position in a large urban school where anonymity felt like protection, and where I could take public transportation instead of walking alone. The transition was difficult, leaving behind the mountain community that had felt like home, but necessary for my mental health and long-term recovery. Brianna still sends updates about Millerville, always careful to avoid mentioning Hillcrest Road or the Wishing Tree. The town installed better lighting throughout the residential areas and organized neighborhood watch programs. But the sense of safety that had defined life there was permanently altered by the knowledge that predators had been living among them for weeks. I know now that small towns are not inherently safer than cities, just more isolated and therefore more vulnerable to organized predators who understand how to exploit trust and routine. My evening walk, which had been a simple pleasure for 3 years, was actually a carefully observed pattern that nearly cost me my life. The investigation also revealed something that still gives me nightmares. The network had been planning to escalate beyond hit-and-run attacks. In Ryan's notes, agents found detailed plans for abductions, including a timeline that suggested I had less than a week before they moved from surveillance to direct action. My attack was actually the beginning of their exit strategy, not the culmination of their plan. Most people can walk home from dinner without calculating escape routes or wondering if the vehicles behind them pose a threat. But I learned that some predators study their victims with the patience of scientists, learning routines and vulnerabilities before striking with precision that makes their crimes appear random when they are actually the result of weeks of careful planning. I never thought my neighbor's farm equipment business would be connected to murder. I was 45, working as an insurance adjuster in Millerville, a small farming community of 3,800 people in central Kansas where everybody knew everybody's business and nothing exciting ever happened. The kind of place where the biggest news of the week was usually someone's prize steer getting loose or the high school football team making it to regionals. My wife Nicole and I had lived there for 15 years, and Justin lived 3 houses down from us for most of that time. Justin was the kind of neighbor you could count on for anything. When the tornado took out half our garage in 2019, he was there the next morning with his tools and lumber, working alongside me to rebuild it without being asked. When Nicole was in the hospital for her emergency appendectomy, Justin brought casseroles for a week and never mentioned the cost or trouble. He was at our wedding anniversary party, our 4th of July barbecues, and every single one of our Christmas Eve gatherings since we moved to Millerville. His farm equipment leasing company seemed like the natural evolution of someone who had grown up around machinery and understood what local farmers needed. Justin had taken over his father's old auto repair shop on Highway 36 and transformed it into something bigger, more modern, catering to the agricultural community that formed the backbone of our local economy. Tractors, combines, irrigation systems, everything a modern farming operation required but might not be able to afford outright. So when Justin approached me at Murphy's Diner on a Tuesday in September, sliding into the booth across from me with that familiar grin, I had absolutely no reason to be suspicious. "I've got a business proposition for you," he said, ordering coffee from Diane behind the counter, who had been serving the same route for 20 years. "Something that could help both of us out financially." The pitch was straightforward and appealing. Justin's equipment leasing business was expanding rapidly, but he needed capital to purchase more inventory to meet demand. He was offering investment opportunities to select local people, promising returns of 15% annually on investments of $10,000 or more. I'd rather work with people I trust than go to some bank in Topeka that doesn't understand agriculture, he explained. The numbers made sense based on what I knew about farming and equipment costs. 15% was higher than anything we could get from CDs or savings accounts, but not so high that it seemed unrealistic given the margins in agricultural equipment. Justin showed me spreadsheets on his laptop, detailed projections for growth, testimonials from farmers who were already leasing equipment and expanding their operations thanks to his financing options. I've already got commitments from Benjamin, Ryan, and Alexander, he mentioned, naming 3 other neighbors, whose financial judgment I respected. We're keeping this local, people who understand the community and want to see it prosper. The idea of being part of something that would strengthen Millerville's economy while providing financial security for Nicole and me was exactly the kind of opportunity we had been hoping to find. Nicole and I discussed it over dinner that night, weighing the pros and cons while our 15-year-old son Anthony did homework at the kitchen table. The investment would represent most of our savings, the money we had been accumulating for Anthony's college education and our own retirement. But 15% returns would actually accelerate those goals significantly if Justin's projections proved accurate. We decided to invest $12,000, essentially our entire emergency fund plus the money earmarked for a new roof. Justin came to our house the following Saturday evening to finalize the paperwork, bringing contracts that looked professional and legitimate, complete with legal language about terms, conditions, and responsibilities. Nicole signed as co-investor, and we shook hands on what felt like the beginning of financial security for our family. The first quarterly payment arrived exactly on schedule in December, a check for $450 that represented our share of the profits from Justin's expanding business. The second payment came in March, right on time, and Justin even included a handwritten note thanking us for our confidence and updating us on recent equipment purchases and lease agreements with farms throughout the county. But the June payment never arrived. When I called Justin's office, his secretary Kayla said he was out of town visiting equipment suppliers and would return my call within the week. The week stretched into 2 weeks, then 3, and my calls were increasingly met with evasive responses about Justin being busy with major deals that required his immediate attention. I drove past Justin's property on Highway 36 one Thursday evening in July and noticed that the lot, which had been full of tractors and combines just months earlier, was completely empty. The building looked abandoned, windows dark. No vehicles in the parking area that had always been bustling with farmers and mechanics during business hours. A for lease sign was posted near the road, something that made my stomach clench with the first real understanding that our investment might be in serious trouble. The next morning, I went to the county courthouse to research property records, hoping to find information about Justin's business operations or perhaps a forwarding address. What I discovered was far worse than simple business failure. The building on Highway 36 had been sold 3 months earlier to a development company from Wichita. Justin no longer owned any property in Millerville, and according to the clerk, he had not filed any business licenses or tax documents for his equipment leasing company in over a year. I called Benjamin, Ryan, and Alexander, the other neighbors Justin had mentioned as investors. None of them had invested any money. In fact, Ryan had never even been approached about the investment opportunity, and Alexander said Justin had only mentioned it in passing without providing any details or paperwork. The testimonials and commitments Justin had described were complete fabrications designed to make me feel confident about investing. Nicole took the news about our financial loss with the kind of quiet devastation that was worse than anger or tears. We had trusted someone we had known for 15 years, someone who had eaten at our table and helped us through difficult times. The betrayal felt more personal and more painful than simple fraud. because it destroyed our faith in the community relationships that had defined our lives in Millerville. But the story became infinitely more horrifying when the FBI arrived in town 6 weeks later. Special Agent Sarah Chen knocked on our door on a Tuesday morning in August, asking questions about our financial relationship with Justin and whether we had noticed anything unusual about his business operations or personal behavior. The questions seemed routine until she asked whether we had visited any of the properties Justin claimed to own or lease for equipment storage. Agent Chen explained that Justin was suspected of running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme that had defrauded investors across 3 states of over $2 million. But the investigation had uncovered something much darker than financial fraud. Several of the properties Justin claimed to own for equipment storage were actually sites where human remains had been discovered, and he was now considered a suspect in multiple homicides dating back several years. The farmhouse 40 miles outside Millerville, where Justin had supposedly stored combines and irrigation equipment, was actually a burial ground for at least 5 people who had been reported missing from small farming communities across Kansas and Nebraska. The FBI had found skeletal remains, personal belongings, and evidence suggesting the victims had been killed execution-style before being buried in hastily dug graves behind the abandoned barn. Agent Chen showed me photographs of the victims, asking whether I recognized any of them or whether Justin had ever mentioned knowing people from outside Millerville. The faces were unfamiliar, but the ages and backgrounds were chillingly similar. All were middle-aged residents of small towns. All had reported missing persons cases that had gone cold within weeks, and all had last been seen meeting with someone about investment opportunities or business deals. The investigation revealed that Justin's equipment leasing company had never actually owned any equipment. The tractors and combines I had seen on his lot were either stolen or temporarily borrowed from legitimate dealers for the purpose of maintaining his cover story. The farmers who had supposedly provided testimonials about his services were either fictional or had been coerced into providing false statements through threats or intimidation. Most terrifyingly, the FBI discovered that Justin had been using investor meetings to identify potential victims for something much worse than financial fraud. Agent Chen explained that several of the murder victims had initially been approached about investment opportunities, just as I had been. The difference was that they had apparently asked too many questions, demanded too much documentation, or threatened to expose his fraudulent operations. "You were lucky," Agent Chen told me during our second interview. "Based on the pattern we've identified, investors who became suspicious or demanding usually disappeared within weeks of making those concerns known. Your decision to research the property records probably saved your life because it meant you discovered the fraud through your own investigation rather than confronting Justin directly." The arrest happened at a truck stop outside Oklahoma City, where Justin had been living under a false identity and apparently scouting for new victims among the farming communities of the Southern Plains. In his possession, authorities found detailed files on dozens of potential investors, including maps to secluded properties and what appeared to be plans for disposing of bodies in various rural locations. Justin confessed to 6 murders in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, though the FBI believes the actual number of victims is much higher. He received 6 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would never be released from federal prison. The $2 million he had stolen from investors was never recovered, apparently spent on maintaining multiple identities and purchasing the tools and vehicles necessary for his killing spree. Nicole and I lost our life savings, but we gained something that felt even more valuable: the knowledge that we had survived an encounter with a serial killer who had been using financial fraud as a cover for murder. The investigation revealed that Anthony had actually been in danger too, because Justin had been asking neighbors about our family routines and whether our son walked home alone from school. The farmhouse where the bodies were found was eventually demolished after the FBI completed their forensic work, but the land remains undeveloped, marked only by a small memorial that lists the names of the confirmed victims. Local farmers still avoid the area, and the access road has been permanently closed by the county, creating a kind of dead zone in the landscape that serves as a constant reminder of the evil that had been operating among us. We moved to Colorado 6 months after Justin's arrest, unable to continue living in a community where we questioned every neighbor's motives and wondered what other secrets might be hidden behind friendly facades. The house in Millerville sold quickly but at a significant loss, as news of the murders had affected property values throughout the area. Nicole found work at a veterinary clinic in Fort Collins, and I transferred to a regional insurance office where no one knew about our experience with Justin or the investment scheme that had almost cost us everything. Anthony adapted to his new school with the resilience of teenagers, though he still has nightmares about the man who helped rebuild our garage and brought casseroles when his mother was sick. I know now that predators can spend years building trust and establishing credibility before revealing their true intentions. Justin had been patient, methodical, creating the perfect cover story for financial fraud while simultaneously identifying potential victims for murder. The investment opportunity was never about money. It was about finding isolated, trusting people who could be eliminated without triggering immediate suspicion. Most people invest with friends and neighbors because they trust the relationships they have built over years of shared experiences. But I learned that some people cultivate those relationships specifically to create opportunities for exploitation and violence. And sometimes the neighbor who helps you rebuild after a tornado is actually a serial killer who has been planning to bury you in an abandoned farmhouse since the day he moved to your street. The thing that haunts me most is remembering how natural and convincing Justin was during every interaction we had over those 15 years. There were no warning signs, no moments where his mask slipped, no behaviors that suggested he was anything other than the helpful neighbor we believed him to be. He attended church every Sunday, coached Little League baseball, and volunteered at the annual corn festival with the same enthusiasm as everyone else in our community. I never thought owning an auto repair shop would put me in a serial killer's crosshairs. I was 32, managing the family business in our small Nebraska town of 4,200 people. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where cars were left unlocked and kids walked to school without parents worrying. My wife Nicole and I had just bought our first house 3 blocks from Main Street, and life was moving along exactly as we had planned it. Quiet, predictable, safe. I had been pulling 12-hour days trying to get the shop ready for winter. That particular evening in late October, I had stayed until almost 11 p.m. working on Mrs. Henderson's old Buick because she needed it for her doctor's appointment the next morning. The only gas station open that late was the Shell on Route 47, about 3 miles outside town where the streetlights ended and the cornfields began. I knew the night clerk Ryan, a kid fresh out of high school who always had his earbuds in and a Monster Energy drink sweating on the counter. My truck's fuel light had been glaring at me for the last 5 miles, and I figured I would grab a coffee too. Maybe one of those packaged sandwiches that had been sitting under the heat lamp since noon. The parking lot was empty except for a beat-up Chevy Silverado parked crooked near the dumpster, rust eating through the wheel wells and one headlight dimmer than the other. I pulled up to pump number 2, killed the engine, and stepped out into the kind of cold that makes your nose hair stiffen instantly. As I was unscrewing my gas cap, I noticed movement near the store entrance. 2 guys I had never seen before, both wearing dark hoodies. One was tall and lanky, maybe 6'3", with nervous energy that had him shifting his weight like a boxer warming up. The other was shorter, stockier, with a thick beard and hands shoved deep in his pockets. They were standing too close to Ryan, who had backed up against the cigarette display, his usual bored expression replaced with fear. I had already started pumping gas when I heard the first shout through the glass doors. The taller one had grabbed Ryan by the collar, lifting him off his feet, while the bearded one was behind the counter yanking at the cash register. I could see Ryan's mouth moving, probably explaining that he could not open the safe, that he did not have the combination. My first instinct was to get in my truck and drive away, call 911 from a safe distance. But then I saw the tall one pull something from his waistband. Even from 30 feet away through glass and bad lighting, I knew exactly what that dark metal shape was. And Ryan was just a kid, probably making minimum wage, definitely not getting paid enough to have a gun pointed at his temple. I left the pump running and started walking toward the store, my work boots crunching on loose gravel. I pulled out my phone, trying to look casual while dialing 911, but my fingers were numb from cold and adrenaline. The dispatcher answered just as I reached for the door handle, and I managed to whisper the address and robbery in progress before sliding the phone into my jacket pocket. The bell above the door chimed when I walked in, that cheerful electronic ding completely wrong for what was happening. Both men spun toward me with sharp predatory awareness. The tall one kept his gun on Ryan but shifted his body to face me. I could see his eyes now. Pale blue, bloodshot, pupils blown wide from what was probably methamphetamine. "Just getting coffee," I said, raising my hand slightly, trying to sound like I had not noticed anything unusual. The tall one studied me for what felt like hours, but was probably 3 seconds, his jaw working like he was chewing invisible gum. That gun hand trembling just enough to make me worry about an accidental trigger pull. That is when I noticed the tall one had moved closer to me, close enough that I could smell him. Stale sweat, cigarettes, and something chemical that burned my nostrils. "You are that mechanic guy," he said. And my whole body went rigid because being recognized meant this was about to get much worse than a simple robbery. "Fixed my cousin's Honda last month." His voice was raspy, like he had been screaming for hours. "Charged him $400 for an alternator." The gun was pointing at me now, wavering between my chest and my face. "That alternator failed already. My cousin had to miss work, lost his job, lost his apartment. That's on you." The logic was completely insane, but arguing with an armed drug addict about warranty policies seemed like a quick way to end up on the evening news. The bearded one was getting agitated, kept saying a name that sounded like Benjamin, and pulling at his partner's sleeve while glancing toward the door. Everything shifted in a matter of seconds. Sirens in the distance, faint but getting louder. Both men heard them at the same time I did. The bearded one bolted for the door immediately, bags clutched against his chest, knocking over a display of windshield wiper fluid that exploded across the floor in blue puddles. But the tall one did not run. Instead, his face went from angry to something else entirely, something blank and decided. "You did this," he said to me, and I knew what was coming before his arm extended fully, before his stance widened, before that finger stopped trembling and became steady with murderous purpose. I threw myself sideways toward the chip aisle, but I was 32 with bad knees from high school football. The first shot caught me in the lower back, right above my belt line, spinning me into the metal shelving. The second shot hit somewhere near my spine as I was falling, and then I could not feel my legs anymore. Just this strange absence where sensation should have been. The linoleum was cold against my cheek, and I could see under the shelves to where Ryan was crawling toward the back exit, leaving bloody handprints in the spreading pool of, blue washer fluid. The tall shooter stood over me for a moment, looking confused, like he had not expected it to be this easy or this awful to shoot an unarmed man. I tried to move, tried to crawl toward help, but below my waist was just nothing. I could taste copper in my mouth and feel something warm spreading under me, soaking through my work shirt, pooling faster than seemed possible. My phone was still in my pocket, the dispatcher probably still on the line. The cops arrived in what felt like hours but was probably under 2 minutes, their flashlights cutting through the store like lighthouse beams. An officer with a mustache knelt beside me, pressing something against my back while talking into his radio using codes I did not understand, but that sounded urgent. The paramedics came next, asking me questions I could not answer, telling me to stay awake when all I wanted was to close my eyes. One of them, a woman with a septum piercing who looked too young to be saving lives, held my hand while they got me on the backboard, saying I was doing great, that I was so strong. The next few months were a haze of surgeries, medical terms I could not pronounce, and learning that incomplete spinal injury meant I would probably never walk normally again. They caught both men 3 days later at a motel 40 miles north. The tall one was named Benjamin Garrett. The bearded one was named Alexander Walsh. Names that became permanent residents in my head, taking up space that should have been occupied by better memories. Benjamin got 25 to life. Alexander got 15 years. Numbers that seemed both too much and not enough for what they had taken from me and my family. Nicole had to sell the shop because we needed the money for medical bills and house modifications. Ramps, grab bars, a hospital bed that made our bedroom look like a care facility instead of the intimate space where we had planned our future together. The town rallied around us with fundraisers at the VFW hall and meal trains that lasted months. But there is a special kind of loneliness in being the guy everyone feels sorry for, in going from fixing cars with your hands to barely being able to hold a wrench steady. I still have dreams where I can run, where my legs work, where I make different choices that night. Maybe I just drive away. Maybe I do not stop for gas at all. But every morning I wake up to the same reality. A wheelchair beside the bed, Nicole's forced smile that does not quite reach her eyes anymore, and the knowledge that one Thursday night at a gas station changed everything. Not just for me, but for everyone who thought our little town was too small for this kind of violence. Most people can walk into a convenience store without calculating exit routes, or wondering if the other customers might be armed. But I know now that evil does not respect small town boundaries, that it can drive up in a rusty Silverado and destroy everything you have built in the space between 2 gunshots. I never thought my environmental testing job would uncover a decades-old murder conspiracy. I was 35, working as a state environmental inspector in Millerville, Colorado, a former mining town of 2,400 people tucked into a valley where the Rocky Mountains created natural barriers that kept the outside world at arm's length. The kind of place where families had lived for generations, where everyone knew each other's business, and where the biggest employer had always been the copper mine until it closed in 1987. My job involved testing soil and water samples throughout the region, ensuring that old industrial sites met current environmental standards before new development could proceed. It was routine work that rarely involved anything more exciting than elevated lead levels or contaminated groundwater from abandoned gas stations. I had been doing similar inspections for 8 years, and Millerville was supposed to be a straightforward assignment. The Blackwater copper mine had been sealed for over 30 years following what official records described as a structural collapse that killed 3 workers. The mine entrance was blocked with concrete barriers, warning signs posted throughout the area, and the entire site was surrounded by chain-link fencing that had rusted but remained intact. My assignment was to assess soil contamination levels in preparation for a housing development planned for the surrounding acreage. Benjamin Walsh, the current sheriff, met me at the site on a Tuesday morning in October, explaining the history of the mine and the 1987 accident that led to its closure. "Tragic business," he said, unlocking the gate that led to the testing area. 3 good men lost their lives when the main tunnel collapsed. The company sealed everything up rather than risk more casualties trying to recover the bodies. Sheriff Walsh seemed genuinely helpful, providing historical documents and maps that showed the mine's layout and the areas where I needed to collect samples. He even offered to accompany me during my initial site survey, though I assured him that would not be necessary. The testing process would take several days, and I preferred to work alone when collecting samples that required precise documentation. The first day's soil samples showed elevated copper levels, which was expected given the site's history, but nothing that would prevent development with proper remediation. I worked methodically, collecting samples in a grid pattern that extended from the sealed mine entrance toward the area where houses would eventually be built. It was on the second day that I discovered the anomaly. While testing soil near what the maps indicated was a ventilation shaft, my metal detector registered something large buried about 4 feet below the surface. The readings suggested metal objects much larger than the typical debris you would find around an old mining operation. I excavated carefully, following proper protocols for potentially hazardous materials, and uncovered what appeared to be a vehicle bumper. Further excavation revealed an entire pickup truck, a late 1980s Ford, buried deliberately and covered with a layer of mine tailings that had concealed it for decades. The truck's license plate was still attached, though corroded. I photographed everything before carefully brushing away enough dirt to read the numbers. A quick check of state records revealed that the vehicle had been registered to Marcus Thompson, reported missing in 1989 along with his wife Catherine and their teenage daughter Jessica. The Thompson family disappearance had been one of the region's most notorious unsolved cases. They had last been seen leaving their home in neighboring Riverside County, supposedly heading to California for a family vacation. Their house was found empty, mail piling up, but no evidence of foul play. The case had eventually gone cold, and most people assumed they had started new lives somewhere else. Finding their truck buried at the mine site changed everything. I immediately called the state police, and within hours the area was swarming with investigators, forensic specialists, and equipment for a full-scale excavation. Sheriff Walsh arrived shortly after the state police, and I noticed his demeanor had changed completely from our friendly interaction the previous day. Detective Sarah Chen from the state police took charge of the investigation, establishing a perimeter around the burial site and beginning the painstaking process of excavating the truck and searching for additional evidence. The work required several days, during which time I continued my environmental testing in other areas while staying available to answer questions about my discovery. The truck contained skeletal remains of 3 individuals, later confirmed through dental records to be the Thompson family. But the forensic examination revealed details that transformed this from a missing persons case into a homicide investigation. All 3 victims had suffered gunshot wounds to the head, and the truck showed evidence of being deliberately driven to this location before burial. Detective Chen interviewed me extensively about my discovery and the circumstances that led to finding the truck. During our conversation, she revealed information that made my blood run cold. The mine had not actually collapsed in 1987. According to geological surveys and mining company records she had obtained, the tunnels were structurally sound at the time of closure. The 3 workers who had supposedly died in the collapse were Marcus Thompson, Catherine Thompson, and their daughter Jessica. The official story about a mining accident had been fabricated to explain their disappearance and provide justification for sealing the mine site, preventing anyone from discovering their bodies. Further investigation revealed that Marcus Thompson had been a whistleblower, threatening to expose illegal dumping practices at the mine that violated federal environmental regulations. The mining company had been disposing of toxic waste in abandoned tunnels, saving millions of dollars in proper disposal costs while contaminating groundwater throughout the region. Marcus had documented these violations and planned to report them to federal authorities, which would have resulted in massive fines, criminal charges, and the mine's immediate closure. Instead of facing those consequences, someone had decided to eliminate the threat permanently. The conspiracy involved multiple levels of law enforcement and local government. Sheriff Walsh's predecessor, Ryan Martinez, had been directly involved in covering up the murders and creating the false narrative about the mining accident. Several county commissioners, mining company executives, and state inspectors had participated in the cover-up, ensuring that no investigation would uncover the truth. Detective Chen's investigation expanded rapidly, examining financial records, interviewing retired employees, and searching for additional evidence of corruption. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, involving millions of dollars in bribes, falsified environmental reports, and systematic intimidation of anyone who might have questioned the official story. But the most shocking revelation came when Detective Chen arrested Sheriff Walsh himself. He had not just inherited the cover-up from his predecessor. He had been actively maintaining it for over a decade. The helpful cooperation he had shown during my initial site visit was actually an attempt to monitor my activities and ensure I did not discover anything that would expose the truth. Analysis of the buried truck revealed that it had been moved to the mine site shortly after the murders, using mining equipment to dig the burial pit and cover it with tailings. The entire operation had been planned and executed with the resources and authority of both the mining company and local law enforcement. The environmental contamination I had been hired to assess was actually much worse than anyone had suspected. The illegal dumping that Marcus Thompson had tried to expose had continued for years after his murder, turning the entire mine site into a toxic waste repository that posed serious health risks to the surrounding community. Federal investigators eventually identified 17 people involved in the conspiracy, including mining executives, county officials, and law enforcement officers. Sheriff Walsh received a life sentence for his role in the murders and cover-up. The mining company faced billions of dollars in cleanup costs and criminal penalties. The housing development that prompted my environmental assessment was permanently canceled. The entire mine site was designated as a Superfund cleanup location, requiring decades of remediation work to address the contamination that had been hidden for so long. I transferred to a different region 6 months after testifying in the trials that resulted from my discovery. Living in Millerville had become impossible once the community learned that their trusted sheriff had been protecting murderers and that their local government had been systematically lying to them for over 30 years. The experience taught me that environmental contamination often reflects deeper forms of corruption, and that the earth itself can preserve evidence of crimes that human institutions work desperately to conceal. Sometimes the most routine investigation can uncover secrets that powerful people have spent decades hiding. Most environmental inspectors test soil for chemical contamination and file reports that few people ever read. But I learned that some of us occasionally discover burial grounds that expose the toxic relationships between money, power, and violence in communities that appear peaceful on the surface. The Blackwater mine site remains closed, surrounded by new fencing and warning signs that tell only part of the truth about what lies beneath the surface. The real memorial to Marcus, Catherine, and Jessica Thompson is not the small marker placed near the former mine entrance, but the environmental cleanup that finally addresses the contamination Marcus died trying to expose. I never thought joining a Facebook group would put me on a predator's hunting list. I was 28, fresh out of a messy divorce, starting over as the new veterinarian in Millbrook, Ohio. A small town of 8,000 people nestled between rolling farmland and suburban sprawl. The kind of place where people still waved at strangers on Main Street and left casseroles on your doorstep when you moved in. After 3 years of marriage counseling and legal fees in Columbus, Millbrook felt like a sanctuary where I could rebuild my life quietly and safely. The veterinary clinic on Maple Avenue was everything I had dreamed of during those long nights in veterinary school. A converted Victorian house with original hardwood floors, large windows that let in afternoon sunlight, and examination rooms that still had the charm of someone's former living spaces. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the retiring vet, had built a practice where farmers trusted her with their prize cattle and families brought their golden retrievers for routine checkups with equal confidence. My apartment was a small one-bedroom above the bakery on Main Street, close enough to walk to work but far enough from my ex-husband's lawyers and process servers. The smell of fresh bread every morning felt like a promise that life could be simple and good again. Nicole, the baker downstairs, always had coffee ready by 6 a.m. and never asked personal questions, which I appreciated more than she probably realized. Joining the Millbrook Community Board Facebook group seemed like the logical next step toward integration. A place to learn about local events, find recommendations for everything from plumbers to pizza, and maybe make connections with people who did not know about my failed marriage or the reasons it ended so badly. The group had 1,200 members, mostly longtime residents sharing updates about school board meetings and lost cats. My introduction post was simple enough. Hi everyone, I'm Megan, the new vet taking over Dr. Hendricks' practice. Looking forward to meeting you all and serving the Millbrook community. Any recommendations for the best coffee shop? Innocent? Professional? The kind of post that should have generated a few friendly replies about local businesses and maybe some questions about veterinary services. Instead, it generated immediate attention that felt slightly off balance. Within an hour, I had 17 comments. Most of them welcoming, but a few that lingered in my memory with uncomfortable specificity. Welcome to town, beautiful. You'll love it here if you know how to appreciate the finer things. Another. Hope you're settling in well. The Victorian apartments on Main Street are charming, but the locks are pretty old. Might want to upgrade for safety. The second comment bothered me enough that I walked downstairs to ask Nicole about building security. She assured me the front door lock had been upgraded recently and that Main Street was perfectly safe, but something in her expression suggested she was not entirely convinced. Just keep your apartment door locked, she said, avoiding eye contact while wiping down the counter with more force than necessary. Alexander Smith started private messaging me 3 days after my introduction post. His profile picture showed a pleasant-looking man in his early 40s, brown hair, kind eyes, wearing a flannel shirt against what looked like a farm backdrop. His posts in the community group were always helpful, informative, the kind of content you would expect from a longtime resident who genuinely cared about his neighbors. Welcome to Millbrook, his first message read. I know starting over in a new place can be overwhelming. If you need any help navigating local services or just want someone to show you around, I'd be happy to help. I've lived here my whole life and know everyone worth knowing. Friendly, appropriate, the kind of offer I might have accepted from a neighbor in a different context. But Alexander's messages became more frequent and progressively more personal. He knew I was divorced before I had mentioned it publicly. He knew I worked late on Thursdays because the clinic stayed open for emergency calls. He knew I lived alone above the bakery, knew my apartment number, knew that I usually got home around 7 p.m. and that my bedroom faced the alley behind Main Street. I noticed your lights were on pretty late last night, one message read. Everything okay? It's not safe for a woman to be wandering around alone after dark in an unfamiliar place. There are people in this town who might take advantage of someone new, someone vulnerable. The The concern felt manufactured, and the word vulnerable made my skin crawl with recognition. I stopped responding to Alexander's messages, but that did not stop them from arriving. 3 or 4 per day, each one revealing more intimate knowledge of my daily routine than any stranger should possess. He knew I bought groceries on Tuesday evenings at the IGA, knew I usually walked to work rather than driving, knew I had been asking around about hiking trails in the state park. The messages shifted from friendly offers to subtle warnings about other people in town. Be careful of the construction workers renovating the bank building. They've been asking about the new vet, specifically whether you live alone, and some of the guys at Murphy's bar have been talking about you. Nothing dangerous, but small-town gossip can get uncomfortable quickly. I started varying my routine, taking different routes to work, shopping at different times, staying late at the clinic to avoid walking home during predictable hours. But Alexander's messages suggested he was adapting to my changes faster than I was making them. Saw you took the back road home tonight. Smart choice. Oak Street has better lighting and more foot traffic. The veterinary clinic's security cameras captured something that made my blood freeze during my 3rd week in town. I had stayed late on a Thursday to monitor a golden retriever recovering from surgery, and around 10 p.m. I noticed movement in the parking lot. A figure standing near the back entrance, not quite close enough to trigger the motion lights, but positioned where he could watch both the clinic and my apartment windows across the street. The video quality was not perfect, but the height and build matched Alexander's profile pictures exactly. He stood there for 47 minutes according to the timestamp, occasionally checking his phone, never moving far enough from the shadows to be clearly visible to anyone looking out casually. When I finally left through the front entrance, he was gone, but my apartment lights were visible from where he had been standing. I called the police the next morning, bringing printed screenshots of Alexander's messages and the security footage. Officer Ryan Mills looked through everything with the patient thoroughness of someone who had dealt with stalking cases before, but his expression told me what I was afraid to hear. Nothing here is technically threatening, he explained. Weird, uncomfortable, definitely crossing boundaries, but not criminal. We can talk to him, ask him to back off, but without explicit threats or physical contact, our options are limited. Alexander stopped messaging me after the police visit, but that felt more ominous than reassuring. The sudden silence suggested he knew about law enforcement involvement, which meant he was either more connected in town than his profile suggested, or more observant than I had realized. My routine changes became more extreme. Different grocery stores in neighboring towns, varying work schedules, asking Nicole to accept packages so I would not have to interact with delivery drivers. The break-in happened on a Tuesday in November during the 3 hours I spent at a veterinary conference in Mansfield. Someone had picked the lock on my apartment door with professional precision, leaving no scratches on the metal, no signs of forced entry. Nothing was missing, but everything felt wrong in ways I could not initially identify. My underwear drawer had been searched, items refolded but not quite in the same positions. My bathroom cabinet showed similar signs of careful inspection. Whoever had been inside had spent time in my bedroom, possibly going through my closet, definitely handling personal items with a thoroughness that made me nauseous to contemplate. The police found no fingerprints, no evidence that would stand up in court, no proof that anyone had been inside at all. Could be you're misremembering how you left things, Officer Mills suggested gently. Stress and paranoia can make people hyper-aware of details that might normally go unnoticed. But I knew what I knew, and what I knew was that Alexander Smith or someone working with him had been inside my home. I hired a private investigator the next day, a former police detective named Sarah Cross, who specialized in stalking and harassment cases. Sarah's background check on Alexander Smith revealed information that shattered any remaining sense of safety I had in Millbrook. Alexander Smith was not a local farmer or longtime resident. Alexander Smith was not even his real name. His actual identity was Marcus Allen Walsh, and he had restraining orders filed against him in 3 different states. The Facebook profile, the helpful community posts, the entire persona of Alexander Smith had been constructed over the course of 18 months, carefully building credibility and local connections in preparation for whatever he was planning to do to me. Sarah's investigation revealed that Marcus had a pattern of targeting women who posted in small-town Facebook groups, particularly women who mentioned being new to the area or recently divorced. He researched his victims thoroughly, sometimes for months, learning their routines and vulnerabilities before making contact. The farm backdrop in his profile picture was stock photography. The helpful posts in community groups were often copied from other towns' Facebook discussions. Most terrifyingly, Marcus had not been working alone. Sarah discovered connections between his activities and at least 2 other fake Facebook profiles in the Millbrook group. The construction workers he had warned me about were actually watching me for him. The men at Murphy's bar discussing me were reporting back to someone who was coordinating my surveillance with frightening efficiency. "You were selected," Sarah explained during our second meeting, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen this pattern too many times before. "New to town, recently divorced, living alone, working a job that requires predictable hours. You checked every box on their target list." The Facebook post was just confirming what they already suspected about your availability and vulnerability. The FBI arrested Marcus Allen Walsh and 2 accomplices 3 weeks later at a motel in Kentucky, where they found detailed files on 17 women across 6 states. My file was the thickest, filled with photographs taken from outside my apartment, copies of veterinary records they had somehow accessed, and a timeline of my daily activities that spanned nearly 2 months. Marcus received 15 years in federal prison. His accomplices got shorter sentences in exchange for cooperation, revealing a network of men who used social media to identify and hunt isolated women in small communities across the Midwest. The Millbrook Community Board Facebook group had been compromised for over a year, with multiple fake profiles gathering intelligence on potential victims. I left Millbrook 3 days after the arrests, driving straight through to Oregon where my sister lives and where I could disappear into a city large enough that anonymity felt possible again. The veterinary practice went to a colleague from veterinary school who had no idea why I was selling so cheaply or why I refused to discuss my reasons for leaving. Nicole from the bakery still sends Christmas cards, always including updates about Millbrook that I read with the fascination of someone who survived a disaster and needs to know the aftermath. The Facebook group was disbanded after the FBI investigation revealed the extent of infiltration. The clinic continues to thrive under new ownership. Life goes on for everyone who was not selected as prey. But I know now that digital communities are hunting grounds, that social media profiles can be elaborate traps, that predators study their victims with the patience and thoroughness of scientists conducting research. I know that small towns are not inherently safer than cities, just easier to monitor and control when you have the right connections and enough advanced planning. Most people join community Facebook groups to find restaurant recommendations and learn about local events. But I learned that some people join to find victims, to identify women who are alone and vulnerable, to gather intelligence for crimes that unfold over months rather than minutes. And sometimes the friendly neighbor who offers to help you settle in is actually a predator who has been preparing to destroy your life since the moment you announced your existence to his hunting ground. The investigation also revealed something that still keeps me awake at night. Marcus had been planning to escalate beyond surveillance and psychological intimidation. In his hotel room, agents found zip ties, duct tape, and a detailed map showing the route from my apartment to an abandoned farmhouse 40 miles outside Millbrook. Sarah told me later that based on similar cases, I probably had less than a week before he moved from watching to acting. I never thought working as a forest ranger would put me face to face with something that defied every natural law I understood. I was 30, stationed at the Pine Ridge Ranger Station in northern Idaho, responsible for monitoring 50,000 acres of wilderness that surrounded our tiny community of maybe 200 year-round residents. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the nearest town was 40 miles of winding mountain roads, and where the biggest excitement was usually a lost hiker or the occasional bear sighting. I had been working these forests for 6 years, knew every trail, every creek crossing, every place where cell phone service cut out completely. The job suited me perfectly after my divorce, offering solitude and purpose in equal measure. My days were spent checking campsites, maintaining trails, and educating tourists who thought a day hike required nothing more than sneakers and a water bottle. The first sign something was wrong came during my regular patrol of the Blackwater Trail in early September. I was checking the primitive campsites along the creek, making sure previous visitors had properly extinguished their fires and packed out their trash, when I noticed the stones. Someone had arranged rocks in a perfect spiral pattern about 15 feet from the established fire ring, each stone precisely placed with mathematical accuracy. Campers occasionally built unauthorized fire rings or stacked rocks as markers, but this was different. The spiral was too precise, too deliberate, and the stones had been selected for specific sizes and colors in a way that suggested knowledge of some system I did not understand. I photographed the arrangement and dismantled it, assuming it was the work of some artistic camper who did not realize they were supposed to leave no trace. But 3 days later, during my next patrol of the area, the spiral was back. Exactly the same pattern, using the same stones I had scattered, rebuilt with the same mathematical precision. This time I left it undisturbed and set up a trail camera about 50 yards away, hidden behind a fallen log where it could monitor the area without being easily spotted. The footage from that first week showed nothing unusual during daylight hours. Hikers passed by without seeming to notice the stone arrangement. A family of deer grazed nearby one afternoon, but the night footage was different. Something moved through the frame around 2:30 a.m. on the fourth night, too quickly for the camera to capture clearly, but large enough to trigger the motion sensor. I reviewed that segment repeatedly, enhancing the image as much as possible with the equipment available at the ranger station. What I saw looked human in size and shape, but the movement was wrong. It glided between trees without disturbing branches, covered ground too quickly, and seemed to understand exactly where the camera was positioned because it remained mostly out of frame. Over the next 2 weeks, I found similar stone spirals at 3 other locations throughout my patrol area. Always in remote spots, always built with the same mathematical precision, always accompanied by other subtle signs that someone or something was moving through the forest with intimate knowledge of the terrain. Broken branches that formed directional arrows, scratched bark on trees that created crude symbols, footprints that appeared for a few yards before vanishing completely. The footprints were the most disturbing discovery. They were roughly human in size and shape, but the stride length was impossible for any person to achieve naturally. The depth and spacing suggested someone taking steps of 8 to 10 feet across uneven forest floor, something that would require superhuman strength and balance. I started carrying additional equipment during my patrols. A better camera, motion sensors, audio recording devices, anything that might help me document whatever was creating these signs. My supervisor, Benjamin, thought I was becoming paranoid about vandalism, but he supported my investigation as long as it did not interfere with regular duties. The breakthrough came during a night patrol in late September. I was checking the Whitman Creek area around midnight when I heard sounds that made my blood freeze. Footsteps moving parallel to my position, maintaining perfect pace with my movement, staying just beyond the range of my flashlight. When I stopped, the footsteps stopped. When I continued, they resumed. I tried calling out, thinking it might be a lost hiker, but received no response. The footsteps continued for nearly 20 minutes, never getting closer but never falling behind, as if something was studying my movements with scientific precision. When I finally reached my vehicle and drove back to the ranger station, I felt eyes watching from the tree line until I was completely out of the forest. The next morning, I found fresh stone spirals at 2 locations I had visited during that night patrol. But these were different from the earlier arrangements. The stones were larger, the patterns more complex, and they incorporated elements that seemed specifically designed to communicate something. Small bones arranged in geometric patterns. Feathers from local birds woven into the stone arrangements. Pieces of bark carved with symbols that resembled no writing system I recognized. I contacted Dr. Sarah Martinez, an anthropologist at the University of Idaho, sending her photographs of the symbols and arrangements. Her response was immediate and alarming. The patterns matched descriptions from Native American folklore about forest entities that existed between the human and spirit worlds. Beings that served as guardians or warnings for people who ventured too deep into sacred wilderness areas. According to Dr. Martinez, several tribes in the region had legends about watchers that monitored human activity in certain forests, particularly areas where ancient burial grounds or ceremonial sites were located. The stone spirals and carved symbols were traditional methods these entities used to mark territory and communicate with humans who were sensitive enough to recognize their presence. But Dr. Martinez also mentioned something that made my situation much more serious. According to the folklore, these entities typically ignored human activity unless they perceived a threat to the forest or its sacred sites. The fact that one was actively engaging with me, creating increasingly complex arrangements and following my movements, suggested it was trying to communicate something urgent. I spent the next week researching the history of the Pine Ridge area, discovering information that the Forest Service had never included in our training materials. The entire region had been used by local tribes for centuries as a burial ground for important leaders and shamans. Several sites throughout my patrol area contained remains that were considered sacred and protected by both federal law and tribal agreements. The revelation that I had been unknowingly walking through ancient burial sites explained the Watcher's behavior. It was not threatening me directly, but trying to educate me about the significance of the areas I was responsible for protecting. The stone spirals were markers indicating sacred sites. The carved symbols were warnings about places where human activity should be limited or avoided entirely. I contacted the regional tribal council, explaining my experiences and asking for guidance on how to properly respect the sacred areas within my patrol zone. The response was swift and supportive. Tribal Elder Ryan Whitehorse agreed to meet with me and conduct a formal blessing ceremony to acknowledge my new understanding of the forest's spiritual significance. During the ceremony, conducted at sunrise near one of the stone spiral sites, Elder Whitehorse explained that the watcher I had been encountering was likely the spirit of an ancient guardian whose responsibility was to protect the burial sites from disturbance. My willingness to learn and adapt had apparently satisfied this spirit, because the mysterious activities ceased immediately after the blessing. The stone spirals remained in place, but they stopped appearing in new locations. The footprints and carved symbols disappeared entirely. My night patrols returned to normal with only the usual sounds of wildlife and wind through the trees. But I maintained the protocols Elder Whitehorse had taught me, approaching certain areas with greater reverence and limiting tourist access to the most sensitive sites. 6 months later, I was promoted to district supervisor, partially because of my work documenting and protecting the cultural resources within the Pine Ridge area. The experience had taught me that forests contain layers of history and significance that extend far beyond what appears on topographic maps or in government databases. I still patrol the same trails, but with different eyes and deeper respect for the ancient connections between land and spirit that most people never recognize. The Watcher taught me that some things in the wilderness demand acknowledgement rather than explanation, and that the most important part of protecting natural areas is understanding their complete history, not just their biological significance. Most forest rangers monitor wildlife populations and maintain recreational facilities. But I learned that some of us are called to serve as bridges between the modern world and ancient responsibilities that predate government agencies by thousands of years. Sometimes the most important part of protecting a forest is recognizing that you are not its first guardian, just its most recent one. The stone spirals still appear occasionally, but now I understand them as gifts rather than warnings. Reminders that the forest holds wisdom older than any human institution, and that true stewardship requires humility before forces we may never fully comprehend, but must always respect. I never thought working the night shift at a truck stop diner would put me on a serial killer's target list. I was 24, waiting tables at Murphy's 24-hour diner in Millerville, Wyoming, a town of 3,400 people that sits right on Highway 47, where truckers and travelers pass through on their way between Denver and Salt Lake City. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's story, where strangers stick out immediately, and where the biggest excitement was usually someone's credit card getting declined or a trucker falling asleep in his rig. The diner was one of those classic roadside establishments that had been serving coffee and pie since the 1960s, with red vinyl booths, a long counter with spinning stools, and a jukebox that still played actual records. I worked the overnight shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., serving coffee to long-haul truckers and the occasional lost tourist who had taken a wrong turn somewhere in the vast Wyoming darkness. My routine was simple and predictable. Clock in at 10, serve truckers and insomniacs until the morning rush started around 5:30. Then walk home to my apartment on Oakwood Drive as the sun came up. It was a 15-minute walk through residential streets that were completely safe, past houses where people left their doors unlocked and kids still played in unfenced yards. The first sign something was wrong came during my second week of March, when a trucker named Alexander started asking questions that felt too personal for casual conversation. He was a regular customer, drove for a freight company out of Nebraska, and usually stopped at Murphy's twice a week on his route. But his questions had shifted from general friendliness to specific curiosity about my schedule, my living situation, and whether I walked home alone. "You shouldn't be walking by yourself at that hour," Alexander said during one of his visits, stirring sugar into his coffee with more attention than the task required. "A pretty young girl like you living alone, there are people who might take advantage of that. Dangerous people pass through here all the time." I assured him that Millerville was perfectly safe, that I had been walking home alone for months without any problems. But Alexander's concern felt manufactured in a way that made me uncomfortable. He knew too much about my routine, mentioned details about my apartment location that I had never shared with any customer. Other truckers started making similar comments, Benjamin, who drove for a different company but seemed to know Alexander, mentioned seeing me walk down Oakwood Drive and suggested that I should consider getting rides home instead of walking alone in the dark. Ryan, another regular, asked whether my family knew I was working nights and walking home by myself. The questions felt coordinated, as if these men were sharing information about me and comparing notes about my habits and vulnerabilities. I started paying closer attention to their conversations, noticing that they often sat together when their stops at the diner coincided, and that they seemed to have detailed knowledge of Millerville's layout despite supposedly just passing through. It was during the last week of March that I realized the scope of what was happening. A trucker I had never seen before came in around 2 a.m., ordered coffee and pie, and spent over an hour asking casual questions about the area. Where did most of the young women in town live? Were there college students? Did people generally feel safe walking alone at night? When I asked him about his route, he gave vague answers about picking up loads in the area but could not name any specific businesses or destinations. His truck was parked where I could see it through the diner's front windows, and I noticed he spent a lot of time looking at a notebook, writing down information between sips of coffee. I started documenting these interactions, writing down license plate numbers, descriptions of the truckers who asked unusual questions, and details about their apparent knowledge of local geography and residents. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. At least 6 different men, all claiming to be independent truckers, had been asking similar questions over the past month. The breakthrough came when I overheard part of a conversation between Alexander and Benjamin during a busy Friday night. They were discussing the girl who walks on Oakwood and mentioning specific details about my apartment building, including which unit I lived in and which direction I approached from when walking home. Most chillingly, Alexander mentioned something about the collection schedule and how I fit the profile perfectly. The conversation ended abruptly when they noticed I was within earshot, but I had heard enough to understand that my routine was being studied by multiple people who were coordinating their observations. I called the Wyoming State Police the next morning, speaking with Detective Sarah Walsh, who specialized in interstate crimes involving truckers and highway predators. She took my report seriously, particularly when I described the coordinated nature of the questioning and the detailed knowledge these men seemed to have about local women and their routines. Detective Walsh explained that law enforcement had been tracking a pattern of disappearances along truck routes throughout the Mountain West, cases where young women working night shifts or walking alone had vanished without a trace. The victims were typically between 20 and 30 years old, lived alone, and worked jobs that required predictable late-night schedules. What you're describing fits a pattern we've been investigating for over a year, Detective Walsh told me. Groups of truckers working together to identify and track potential victims in small towns along their routes. They share information, study routines, and coordinate abductions that appear random but are actually carefully planned operations. The state police set up surveillance around the diner and my apartment, monitoring the truckers who had been asking questions about me. They also installed recording equipment to document conversations between the suspected predators, hoping to gather evidence that would support federal charges for conspiracy and interstate trafficking. The arrest happened 3 weeks later when Alexander and Benjamin attempted to approach me while I was walking home from work. They had parked their truck strategically along my route, with Alexander waiting near my apartment building while Benjamin positioned himself to block my normal path, forcing me to walk past where Alexander was waiting. Plainclothes officers intervened before they could make contact with me, arresting both men and discovering evidence in their trucks that revealed the extent of their operation. They found detailed files on dozens of women throughout Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado, including photographs, work schedules, and home addresses gathered during months of surveillance. The investigation expanded rapidly, revealing a trafficking network that involved 17 truckers operating across 8 states. They had been abducting women from small towns along their routes, transporting victims across state lines and selling them to buyers in major cities. The operation had been active for over 3 years, and law enforcement believes they were responsible for at least 23 disappearances. Alexander received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Benjamin and 4 other core members of the network received sentences ranging from 25 to 40 years. The remaining truckers received shorter sentences in exchange for cooperation, but their testimonies revealed the sophisticated planning and coordination behind what had appeared to be random disappearances. I quit my job at Murphy's Diner and moved to Colorado Springs 2 months after the arrests, unable to continue living in Millerville, where I constantly worried about whether other predators might be studying my routines. The knowledge that I had been selected as a target, that my daily activities had been documented and shared among criminals planning my abduction, made it impossible to feel safe in familiar surroundings. The diner closed permanently 6 months later, unable to recover from the negative publicity surrounding the case. Highway 47 still carries truckers and travelers through Millerville, but the town installed additional street lighting and organized community watch programs to monitor suspicious activity around businesses frequented by transient workers. Detective Walsh told me that my willingness to document the suspicious behavior and report it promptly probably saved my life and prevented other abductions. The network had been planning to take me during my walk home on April 15th, exactly 2 weeks after I contacted law enforcement. My cooperation provided the evidence needed to identify and arrest the entire operation. I still work night shifts, but now in a large city where anonymity provides security and where public transportation eliminates the need to walk alone through predictable routes. The experience taught me that predators often hide behind legitimate occupations and normal appearances, and that what seems like casual conversation can actually be intelligence gathering for criminal purposes. Most people who work night shifts worry about drunk customers or difficult co-workers. But I learned that some of us are being studied by organized criminals who see our routines as opportunities and our isolation as vulnerability. Highway truck stops and late-night diners can serve as hunting grounds for predators who understand that small-town trust and predictable schedules create perfect conditions for crimes that leave few witnesses and fewer clues. The network's files revealed that they had been monitoring Murphy's Diner for over 2 years, documenting the schedules and routines of every female employee. I was their primary target, but they had backup plans involving 2 other women who worked in town. The coordinated surveillance and planning involved in their operation was more sophisticated than anything local law enforcement had encountered, requiring federal resources and interstate cooperation to fully investigate and prosecute. Millerville still feels the impact of discovering that their small town had been a hunting ground for interstate traffickers. Property values declined, several businesses closed, and many families moved away rather than continue living in a community that had been systematically stalked by criminals who understood exactly how to exploit rural isolation and small-town routines for predatory purposes. I never thought working part-time at a pharmacy would expose me to a conspiracy that connected murder to prescription fraud. I was 38, recently divorced, trying to rebuild my life in Millerville, Colorado, after losing nearly everything in my ex-husband's investment schemes. The town felt like the perfect place to start over, small enough that people looked out for each other, but large enough that I could maintain some privacy about my past failures. Henderson's Pharmacy on Main Street was exactly what I needed after the chaos of my marriage collapsed. Clean, quiet work organizing inventory, processing insurance claims, and helping customers with routine prescriptions. The pay was modest, but it was honest work that let me sleep at night, something I had not been able to do during the final months of fighting lawyers and creditors. Dr. Anthony had been the town pharmacist for over 20 years, one of those trusted community figures who knew everyone's medical history and family secrets. People brought their prescriptions to Henderson's not just because it was convenient, but because Dr. Anthony remembered their names, asked about their children, and genuinely cared about their health and well-being. During my second week on the job, I started noticing patterns in the prescription orders that seemed unusual for a small-town pharmacy. Large quantities of pain medication being ordered for patients I knew had died months earlier. Expensive drugs prescribed to people who, according to local knowledge, had never been seriously ill. Prescription bottles being prepared for pickup but never collected, accumulating in storage bins behind the counter. When I mentioned these observations to Dr. Anthony, his response was immediate and defensive. "Patient privacy is sacred," he told me, his voice carrying an edge I had never heard before. "We cannot discuss individual prescriptions or make assumptions about what people need. Our job is to fill what doctors prescribe, not to question medical decisions." His reaction felt disproportionate to what had been casual observations about workflow efficiency, but I attributed it to professional caution and my own inexperience in pharmacy operations. I focused on learning my duties and avoiding further questions about prescription patterns that were probably normal but unfamiliar to someone new to the business. It was during my third week that I discovered the storage room in the basement that Dr. Anthony had told me was for old records and equipment. While looking for inventory supplies, I found boxes of prescription medications that had supposedly been dispensed to customers but were clearly still in the pharmacy's possession. Thousands of pills, bottles still sealed, representing tens of thousands of dollars in medications that insurance companies had paid for but patients had never received. The medications were primarily pain management drugs, anxiety medications, and other controlled substances that had high street value. The quantities were staggering, suggesting systematic fraud over months or years rather than isolated incidents of unclaimed prescriptions. I photographed several boxes before leaving the storage room, uncertain about what I had discovered, but knowing it represented something serious enough to require documentation. That evening, I researched prescription fraud, learning about the connection between illegally diverted medications and both organized crime and individual dealers who supplied black market drug operations. The next morning, Dr. Anthony called me into his office, his demeanor completely different from the friendly employer I had come to know. "Someone has been in the storage room without authorization," he said, watching my reaction carefully. "That area contains confidential patient records and is off limits to all staff except myself." I assured him I had only been looking for inventory supplies, but his expression remained hostile and suspicious. "Patient privacy violations are federal crimes," he continued. "People who compromise medical confidentiality can face serious legal consequences, including criminal charges that would make it impossible to find employment in healthcare or other professional fields." The threat was clear, even though it was couched in language about regulatory compliance. Dr. Anthony was warning me to stay away from the storage room and to keep quiet about anything I might have seen. But his reaction confirmed that what I had discovered was significant enough to justify intimidation. Over the next week, I paid closer attention to the pharmacy's operations, documenting discrepancies between prescription orders, insurance billing, and actual dispensing. The pattern that emerged was systematic fraud involving fake prescriptions, billing for medications never delivered to patients, and diversion of controlled substances for illegal distribution. Dr. Anthony was working with someone to generate fraudulent prescriptions using the names and insurance information of deceased patients and people who had moved away from the area. The medications were being billed to insurance companies and government programs, but instead of being dispensed to patients, they were being accumulated for resale on the black market. But the operation was more complex than simple prescription fraud. I discovered that some of the fake prescriptions were being written for people who had died under suspicious circumstances. Individuals whose deaths had been explained as natural causes or accidents, but who had been in good health before their sudden passing. Among the names on fraudulent prescriptions, I recognized several people who had died within the past 2 years. Margaret Thompson, an elderly woman who had supposedly died of heart failure but had been active and healthy just weeks before her death. Robert Jenkins, a middle-aged farmer who had allegedly died in a farming accident but whose injuries, according to local gossip, had been inconsistent with the official explanation. The realization that Dr. Anthony might be connected to suspicious deaths in addition to prescription fraud made my situation much more dangerous. If he was willing to commit murder to maintain his fraudulent operation, my knowledge of his activities put me at serious risk. I contacted the Drug Enforcement Administration, speaking with Agent Benjamin Martinez, who specialized in prescription fraud and pharmaceutical diversion cases. Agent Martinez took my report seriously, particularly when I described the connections between fraudulent prescriptions and recent deaths in the community. What you're describing could be part of a systematic operation involving both fraud and homicide, Agent Martinez explained. Pharmacists who kill patients to maintain fraudulent prescriptions represent one of the most dangerous types of healthcare fraud because they have both the means and the access necessary to commit murders that appear natural. The DEA launched an investigation, installing surveillance equipment in the pharmacy and monitoring Dr. Anthony's communications and financial transactions. They also began reviewing the medical records and death certificates of people whose names had been used for fraudulent prescriptions, looking for evidence of homicide disguised as natural death. The breakthrough came when forensic pathologists exhumed the bodies of 3 people whose names appeared on fraudulent prescriptions written after their deaths. Toxicology analysis revealed lethal doses of medications that Dr. Anthony had access to through his pharmacy. Drugs that would cause symptoms resembling heart failure or other natural causes of death. Dr. Anthony was arrested at the pharmacy during normal business hours, an event that shocked the entire community. People who had trusted him with their most intimate health information discovered that he had been systematically defrauding insurance programs, diverting controlled substances, and murdering patients who might have exposed his crimes. The investigation expanded to include law enforcement officers who had failed to properly investigate suspicious deaths, medical examiners who had signed death certificates without adequate examination, and insurance investigators who had ignored patterns of fraud. The conspiracy involved multiple levels of the healthcare and legal systems, all working to protect a murderous pharmacist. Dr. Anthony confessed to 7 murders in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, though investigators believe the actual number of victims was much higher. He had been killing patients who asked too many questions about their medications, who noticed discrepancies in their prescriptions, or who threatened to report irregularities to authorities. The pharmacy closed permanently after Dr. Anthony's arrest, leaving the community without convenient access to prescription medications. Many residents had to drive 40 miles to the nearest town for prescriptions, a hardship that particularly affected elderly and disabled people who had depended on Henderson's pharmacy for decades. I moved to Denver 3 months after the arrests, unable to continue living in a community where I had unknowingly worked for a serial killer who had used prescription fraud to cover his murders. The knowledge that I had been processing fake prescriptions for dead patients, some of whom Dr. Anthony had killed personally, made it impossible to feel comfortable in Millerville. The experience taught me that healthcare fraud often masks more serious crimes and that people in trusted positions can exploit that trust to commit murder with impunity for years before being discovered. Dr. Anthony had killed 7 people, stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars, and corrupted multiple systems designed to protect public health, all while maintaining the facade of a caring small-town pharmacist. Agent Martinez told me that my decision to document the suspicious patterns and report them promptly prevented additional murders and exposed a conspiracy that might have continued for years. Dr. Anthony had been planning to expand his operation, recruiting other pharmacists in neighboring towns to participate in the fraud and murder scheme. Most people trust their pharmacists to provide medications safely and legally. But I learned that some healthcare providers use their professional credentials to commit sophisticated crimes that exploit both insurance systems and patient trust. The prescription medications that are supposed to heal can become tools for fraud, theft, and murder when dispensed by someone who values profit over human life.